The night I had the Black Mountain Overlook incident, I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment heading to a small dealership in North Carolina. It was late September, the kind of evening where the air already carried the brittle promise of winter, and the Pisgah National Forest felt heavier, older, and colder than usual. I had been pushing the logbook limits, trying to shave off 4 hours by taking an old Forest Service road, State Route 118, I think they called it, instead of sticking to the main interstate loop. My dispatcher had warned me off it, said it was barely paved and rarely maintained, but I was young and arrogant, fueled by caffeine and the desire to be home by the next evening. It was about 1:45 a.m. when I passed the last little settlement, nothing more than a few mobile homes huddled around a defunct gas pump. After that, the blacktop narrowed, the double yellow lines vanished, and the trees closed in. The air became thick with the smell of damp pine needles and the distant, metallic scent of wet leaves turning to rot. I felt that immediate, classic Appalachian isolation, the knowledge that if anything went wrong, I was utterly, completely alone. Even the CB was dead quiet, just the low, comforting hiss of static reminding me how far out I was. Around 2 a.m., my headlights caught an old wooden sign. It was weathered gray, leaning slightly, with hand-painted letters that read, Black Mountain Overlook, 1 mile. Trailhead parking. It was just a small piece of road infrastructure, but it was a marker, a sign that someone at some point had been here and tried to make sense of the wilderness. I glanced at it, filed the image away, and drove on, the massive truck struggling a little as the road started to climb the foothills. I must have driven for a solid 20 minutes, navigating switchbacks and shallow streams that pooled across the road. My speedometer consistently hovered around 35 miles per hour. The speed limit here was a joke, but 35 felt like reckless speed on that crumbling surface. I was thinking about breakfast and the warm coffee I brew when I finally stopped, my mind on autopilot. Then I saw it again. Same road configuration. Sharp left bend, small, rotting wooden guardrail, and there on the right side of the road was the identical sign. Black Mountain Overlook, 1 mile. Trailhead parking. My foot immediately came off the gas pedal. I squinted into the rearview mirror. No other turn-offs, no unmarked logging trails. I hadn't made a U-turn. I hadn't even paused. I had been driving forward in a continuous line. I checked the dash clock. 2:22 a.m. It felt like I just passed this sign. My first thought was exhaustion. I figured I must have taken a massive, looping switchback that led me back to the start of a long straightaway, but the terrain didn't support it. I hadn't been descending. I'd been climbing steadily. I laughed nervously, a dry, grating sound in the silent cab. You're tired, Mike. Pull over, grab an hour. But I didn't stop. I pressed on, determined to break whatever weird optical illusion the mountain was playing on me. I watched the sign shrink in my side mirror, that old, dark wood fading back into the trees. And that's when the laughter died in my throat. The sign wasn't fading. It was turning. Slowly, I saw the reflective paint of the letters Overlook momentarily catch the red taillights. And then, slowly, deliberately, the whole wooden plank rotated on its vertical post. It turned a quarter, then half, until the front face was completely obscured, facing the dense, silent wall of pines. It was impossible. There was no wind. The truck was moving. The post was embedded in hard-packed dirt. A sign like that doesn't just rotate 180 degrees by itself. It was the movement, the smooth, agonizingly slow rotation, that chilled me to the bone. It was controlled. It was intentional. I watched the blank, gray back of the sign for another 20 yards before I forced myself to look forward. I was breathing shallowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel, so hard my knuckles were white. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. I hadn't just seen a navigational error. I had seen something exhibit an act of silent, unsettling will. I drove for another mile, shaking off the image, trying to rationalize it as a poorly set signpost or a trick of the light. But the dread was a cold knot in my stomach. I finally found a wide enough spot, a gravel maintenance pull-off, and I hit the air brakes, the hiss sounding deafening in the wilderness. I killed the engine and sat in the sudden, oppressive silence. Only the sound of the cooling engine ticking and creaking broke the vacuum. I took a deep breath, grabbed my heavy-duty Maglite, and swung the door open. The metallic scent of the cab was immediately replaced by the sharp, earthy smell of the forest. And beneath that, something else. A faint, lingering smell that was sickly sweet, like dried fruit left in the sun, mixed with raw, wet earth. I didn't climb down all the way. I stood on the running board, holding the flashlight steady, peering back down the road in the direction I had come. My beam cut a weak tunnel into the darkness. I saw nothing, but then I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong in the woods. A soft, rhythmic thump, drag. It was coming from the darkness I had just driven out of. It was getting closer, and it was moving fast, faster than any human could run with that kind of injury. The thump was heavy, solid, and landed with a sickening wetness, like a barefoot stepping on marshy ground. The drag followed immediately after, a scraping, gritty sound, like a broken bone or something impossibly heavy being pulled unevenly across the rough asphalt. It was the sound of something powerful and gravely injured, moving with purpose. I felt a sudden, animal panic seize me. It was too fast, too regular for a deer or a bear, and too intentional for a piece of falling debris. It sounded like something with the anatomy of a man, but the size of my truck. Thump, drag. It was close enough now that the sound was echoing slightly between the rock faces and the tree line. It was no longer a noise in the distance. It was a rhythmic pulse of dread. I could almost feel the vibration through the ground where the thump landed, and it was tracking me. The speed indicated a clear, desperate focus. It sounded like it was closing the gap. I didn't need to see it. Whatever had turned that sign, whatever was following the road I had just traveled, was now approaching, and the sound alone was a direct threat. The sudden realization that the sign had turned away from me, as if sealing off my path, made my blood run cold. It wasn't warning me, it was marking me. I dropped the flashlight onto the running board, scrambled back into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and fumbled the key into the ignition. The air brakes released with a loud, terrified hiss that seemed to mock my fear. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the gear shift into drive, flooring the accelerator. I drove like a madman, the trailer fishtailing slightly as I rounded the corners, the speed gauge hitting 60, then 70 miles an hour on a road that should have crippled the rig. I didn't care about the logbook or the tires or the load. All I cared about was putting miles between myself and that awful sound. I kept the headlights on high beam and glued my eyes to the passenger side mirror. The road was a twisting tunnel of fog and blackness behind me. For the longest, most terrifying 5 minutes of my life, I saw nothing, but I heard it. Not audibly through the window, but I felt it in the rhythm of the truck's vibration. It was a subtle, secondary tremor that seemed to be synced up with the thump drag I had heard. Then for a flash, way back where the road straightened out, I saw a reflection. It wasn't the square reflection of a vehicle's headlights. It was a single, long, pale, distorted flash that rose briefly above the low fog line, almost as tall as the trees, before dipping again. And that's when the sound changed. It was no longer a rhythmic injury. It was a fast, desperate, high-pitched scratching like a long, hard fingernail raking along dry wood. It wasn't coming from the road behind me. It was coming from the driver's side of my own trailer, right next to the diesel tank. I screamed, a sound that got swallowed by the engine noise. I looked out the driver's window, heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped animal. I saw nothing, but I felt the heat of my own terror. I jammed the gear shift down another notch, pushing the old semi past its limit, driving blindly into the darkness until the road finally widened. The trees retreated, and I saw the distant, sickly orange glow of a major interstate highway sign. I drove 300 more miles without stopping, pulling into a massive, brightly lit truck stop just as the sun broke over the horizon. I walked around the cab, shaking, my knees weak. I checked the trailer, the axles, the tires. There was no visible damage, no blood, no mud. The only thing I found was on the back corner of the sleeper cab, right next to where my head had been resting. Scored deeply into the thick, dark green paint was a single long, thin mark. It was curved, almost like a piece of calligraphy, ending in a wickedly sharp, precise point. It was too high to be a road hazard, too deep to be a stray rock. It was a deliberate gouge, a physical signature left by something that moves like a ghost and smells like old death. A marker to let me know that even though I had escaped the circle, whatever had turned that sign backward had been close enough to scratch a terrifying warning into the metal skin of my truck. I never took a shortcut through Appalachia again. I took the long way around every time, and I never, ever checked my rearview mirror on a deserted forest road after 2 a.m. I know what I saw, and I know what followed me. It was hunting, and I was the one who had driven right into its territory. Story 2. It was late October, and the Alleghenies were already punishingly cold. I was driving a load of perishable goods, dairy, ironically, from Pennsylvania down towards Charlotte, and I was on the last leg of a nearly 18-hour shift. The combination of mandatory rest time and sheer, overwhelming exhaustion meant I had to stop. I bypassed the brightly lit, crowded truck stops on I-77, opting instead for a tiny, barely marked rest area off a quiet state route, figuring the isolation would let me sleep better. The rest stop was less a facility and more a wide gravel pull-off with a single, rusted picnic table and a sign warning against littering. It was utterly, perfectly dark, wrapped tight in the mountain forest. I parked my rig as far back from the road as possible, killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was immediate and absolute. It wasn't the dead silence of a city at night. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a place where noise is swallowed by ancient trees and thick mountain fog. I set my alarm for 4 hours later, pulled my sleeping bag over me, and tried to settle in. Before drifting off, I picked up my phone to check the time, and a screen flashed my lock screen wallpaper, a slightly blurry photo of my son, Alex, grinning with a missing front tooth, taken last summer. He was back home in Cincinnati with his mother, over 400 miles away. I smiled, set the phone back on the dash display face up, and finally let my eyes drift shut, pulling the cold comfort of the Appalachian solitude around me. I must have been asleep for about an hour when the sound pulled me back out. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent. A thin, high-pitched whimper, like a hurt dog or perhaps a small child. It came from the dense, tangled undergrowth about 50 yards from my passenger side. I lifted my head, straining to hear over the distant, muffled tink, tink, tink of the cooling engine block. The sound faded entirely for a moment, and I told myself it was just a fox or maybe a coyote. Out here, every animal sounds like a person in distress. Then it came again, closer this time, and unmistakably different. It wasn't a whimper anymore. It was the ragged, choked-off sound of a fully grown man sobbing. Deep, gut-wrenching grief. Someone was hurt or deeply lost, and they were very close. My training immediately kicked in. Check, assess, assist. I reached for my radio, then stopped. There was no cell service, and the CB was useless this far into the back roads. I couldn't call for help. If this was a breakdown or an accident, I was the only resource. I slowly, cautiously reached for the window crank. I rolled the passenger side window down just an inch, enough to catch sound without inviting trouble. The crying stopped instantly. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing against the cab. I waited, holding my breath, my entire body tense. The smell of pine and cold air rushed in through the tiny gap, but with it, a faint, sweet, strangely unsettling odor, like old, stale laundry and something powerfully musky, almost deer-like. I was about to roll the window back up and put the situation down to a false alarm when the voice came. It was a whisper, a sound barely louder than the dry rustling of leaves on the ground, but it was perfectly clear and completely without echo, as if the speaker was pressed right up against the cold glass of my cab door. The voice was deep, raspy, and carried an unnerving, deliberate articulation, and it spoke directly to me. "Why did you leave Alex in the city, Daddy?" The blood instantly drained from my face, turning my entire body to ice. My mind fractured, unable to reconcile what I had heard. Alex, my son's name, the name I had last seen printed in pixels on my phone screen. No one in this state, no one on this route knew my name, much less the name of my 9-year-old boy hundreds of miles away. It wasn't a question I had asked myself out loud. It was a thought, a vague worry I'd had earlier about missing his school play. The voice repeated the question, this time with a horrifying, moist emphasis on the D in daddy. Why did you leave Alex in the city? I couldn't move. I was locked in a primal, cold panic, staring straight ahead at the black void of the windshield. I forced myself to slowly turn my head toward the dash, where my phone still glowed faintly, Alex's innocent, smiling face on the screen, a beacon for whatever was outside. It had seen him. It had looked at my son's picture and then looked at me. I tried to speak, to yell, but my throat was tight, dry, and seized up with fear. I could only manage a silent, desperate wheeze. The thing outside must have sensed my paralysis, my terror. Its voice dropped lower, becoming a wet, hungry hiss, almost musical in its dreadfulness. It began to mimic the sounds of the woods, a chattering squirrel, then the faint snap of a distant twig, then abruptly, the sound of a human clearing its throat. And then it did something worse than speaking. It made a sound that was pure, focused hunger, a low, rhythmic clack-click-clack that sounded exactly like the quick, dry closing of teeth, followed by a sound of deep, rasping inhalation, as if taking in my scent. That sound, the sound of something actively preparing to feed, snapped me out of my fear. I threw my hand toward the passenger window crank, wrenching it up with a violent, panicked urgency. The glass rose slowly, agonizingly, grinding against the cold frame. Just before it sealed, I heard the whisper one last time, right against the window, "He's waiting for you to come home." But the inflection wasn't a comfort. It was a promise, a threat that my safety was tied to my proximity to him. My other hand was already fumbling the key into the ignition. It caught immediately, the massive diesel engine roaring to life, shattering the silence with a blast of noise and vibration. I didn't care about the logbook or the noise complaint. I slammed the gear shift into drive. As the truck lurched forward, my headlights swept across the area where the voice had been. For a fraction of a second, in the periphery of my vision, I saw it. A shadow, not quite a man, too tall to be a bear, that flashed across the edge of the light beam. It was impossibly lean, a towering silhouette that moved with a sickening, rapid grace, vanishing back into the wall of trees before I could properly register its shape. It moved like something that had long forgotten how to use its limbs efficiently, using them instead with powerful, frantic speed. I hit the accelerator, the tires spitting gravel back toward the darkness. I drove out of the rest stop and back onto the state route, pushing the speed limit, my eyes darting frantically between the road ahead and the side mirrors. I got about a mile down the road, heart still slamming against my ribs, when I heard it again, not the voice but a sound that traveled through the metal of the truck itself. It was a long, shuddering, drawn-out sound of pure, hungry disappointment. A sigh, but deeper than any human could produce, a sound of heavy, agonizing breath being released like a bellows collapsing, laced with a faint, rattling sound in the throat, almost like a dry choke. It sounded less like grief for the missed opportunity and more like calculating, patient anticipation for the next one. The feeling I got was not one of escape, but of a brief, temporary reprieve granted by my own speed. I kept driving, the windows up, the cabin heat cranked high, but I couldn't shake the coldness that had settled in my bones. I drove for 6 solid hours until the first pale light of the pre-dawn sky broke over the eastern ridge, turning the black forest into recognizable shapes of brown and gray. I didn't stop until I reached a major chain restaurant parking lot filled with other trucks and the smell of cooking food. When I finally felt safe enough to stop, I spent 20 minutes wiping down my dash, trying to clean off the faint, oily residue that seemed to have materialized on the phone screen right over Alex's face. I couldn't bring myself to delete the photo, but I changed the lock screen immediately. I never told anyone about the encounter on the road, not my dispatcher, not my ex-wife, and especially not Alex. But every time I speak his name now, that cold, precise whisper echoes in the back of my mind. I never did figure out how it knew. Maybe it wasn't the picture. Maybe out there in those ancient, hungry hills, the things that watch us don't need a photograph to know what a man cherishes most. Maybe they just listen for the worries buried in your deepest thoughts and use them to call you out of the light. I still drive that route, but I stick to the interstate, and when the fog rolls in thick over the Alleghenies, I keep the music loud, the windows tightly sealed, and I never, ever let my phone display my son's picture again. I know it's still out there, hungry, patient, and waiting for me to be tired enough to stop one more time. Story 3. The night the deer taught me what true panic looks like, I was running a long haul through eastern Kentucky, trying to make good time down a ribbon of county road that snaked through the Daniel Boone National Forest. It was early November, and the weather had turned sour. A thick, wet fog had rolled in off the mountains, clinging to the valleys and swallowing the beam of my headlights. The asphalt was slick, the trees pressed in tight, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet decay. I had my windows cracked just enough for the sound of the tires to keep me awake, and the isolation was absolute. No traffic, no lights, just the dense, breathing darkness. I crested a slow, gentle rise, and my high beams cut through a thin patch of fog, revealing a massive creature standing dead center in my lane. It was a mature, 10-point buck, a magnificent animal with a rack that looked too heavy for its head. I hit the air brakes gently, the massive truck groaning as I slowed down. I expected the deer to bolt, as they always do, spooked by the lights and the noise. But this one didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, its head turned sharply, staring not at my vehicle, but intently into the impenetrable blackness of the woods on the right side of the road. It was frozen in a posture of profound, silent dread, like a statue carved out of fear. I gave a short tap on the air horn, just a soft whoosh to startle it. Nothing. The deer remained locked, its muscles coiled, eyes wide and reflecting the headlights like two chips of ice. I waited, engine idling low, the fog wrapping itself around the cab. The whole scene felt wrong, like watching a painting that had been paused mid-stroke. A deer that large and healthy doesn't just freeze like that unless it's staring down a threat it knows it cannot outrun. As I sat there, about 40 feet from the animal, I noticed something subtle about the road surface between us. The road itself was cracked asphalt edged by loose gravel and dirt. And running across the width of the road, right under the deer's nose, was a distinct, fresh line. It looked exactly like someone had taken a heavy, blunt object, a chain or a shovel handle, and dragged it horizontally across the road, disturbing the fine gravel and leaving a faint, perfect scar that ran from the tree line on the left straight across the asphalt and into the trees on the right. It was a freshly scored line in the dirt that cut the world in two. I looked at the deer. It was rigid, its hooves resting precisely on the clean side of the line, its gaze still fixed on the woods to the right. It was refusing to cross that mark. Then, the woods on the right side, the side the deer was staring at, offered sound. Not a crash or a snap, but a low, soft, wet suck sound, followed by the faint hiss of displaced leaves. It was barely audible, but the buck heard it. What happened next was not the graceful leap of a wild animal. It was pure, unfiltered terror. The buck didn't just move, it exploded backward. It reared up, a desperate, silent motion, scrambling with its hooves to gain purchase on the asphalt, almost tripping over its own legs in its haste to retreat from the line. It turned its entire body in a panic-stricken whirl and launched itself into the woods on the left, crashing through the brush with a violence that sounded like a small car wreck, utterly losing all sense of direction or self-preservation, just focused on putting that line and the woods on the right behind it. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline spiking. I had been witness to a level of primal fear I had never seen, driven by something the deer couldn't look away from, yet wouldn't cross a simple line to confront. I rolled slowly forward, inch by inch, pushing the truck past the spot where the deer had stood. I drove my front tires over that faint scar in the gravel, trying to tell myself it was just a maintenance crew's error, a piece of equipment being dragged. As the cab passed over the mark, I glanced to the right, into the dark forest where the buck had been staring. The high beams of the truck finally illuminated the edge of the woods and the bank of disturbed gravel right beside the asphalt. And there they were, 2 feet, They were bare, dark, and pressed firmly into the disturbed gravel, right on the edge of the asphalt, just beyond the line. They weren't shoes. They were long, impossibly thin, and ended in toes that looked stretched and almost jointless. They were the color of wet, rotten wood, too long and narrow to belong to any average human being, and they were positioned perfectly parallel to the road, standing with an almost unnatural stillness. They weren't muddy, but they looked unnervingly wet, glistening faintly in the truck light. I didn't see the legs. I didn't see the body. My high beams only reached the level of the ankles, and above that, the darkness was absolute and immediate, like a black curtain had been drawn 10 feet high. I knew that whatever those feet were attached to was tall, silently waiting, and perfectly concealed by the low fog and the thickness of the trees. The feet were pressed into the earth with a strange, deliberate weight, almost like it was anchored there, and they were staring right at me. Or rather, the creature attached to them was. The only sound now was the low shudder of my engine. The heavy, musky smell I had faintly noticed when I stopped now rushed into the cab through the cracked window, overwhelming the clean smell of the pines. It was a smell of stale air, decay, and something rankly animalistic. I didn't hesitate. I didn't reach for my phone or my flashlight. I just put the pedal down, hard. The engine screamed as I launched the truck forward, breaking the terrifying tableau. I drove past the feet, past the invisible towering presence, not daring to look in my side mirror. I knew with absolute certainty that the second my gaze left the road, whatever was standing there would move, and it would move faster than anything I had ever encountered. I drove for 40 minutes at a terrifying speed, my hands slick with sweat. The memory of those unnaturally long, dark feet burned into my mind. When I finally hit the interstate, bathed in the normal glow of sodium lamps, I pulled over into a brightly lit service plaza, trembling. I killed the engine and sat there, trying to regain control. I looked at the dark forest line bordering the plaza and felt a residual chill. I still didn't know why that deer refused to step over that line. Was it a boundary? A rule? Had the creature drawn that scar in the gravel deliberately, and the deer, somehow knowing the ancient, unspoken laws of the woods, honored it? And why did I, the outsider, the man of steel and diesel, get to drive right over it? Maybe the line wasn't for me. Maybe the line was to keep whatever was behind it in, or maybe more terrifyingly, to keep the prey corralled. Whatever the reason, the image of that majestic, panicked deer, choosing total chaos over stepping 1 inch across a simple scratch in the dirt, told me everything I needed to know about the horrifying power of the stillness I had just encountered. I had crossed a threshold that night, and I drove away knowing that something tall, thin, and impossibly patient was standing guard over its territory, its bare, awful feet pressed into the cold Appalachian earth, waiting for the next tired traveler to come along. Story 4. The incident happened deep in the Monongahela National Forest, right on the border of West Virginia and Virginia, where the old logging trails crisscross the mountains like faint, forgotten scars. I was driving a refrigerated unit, a full load of flash-frozen poultry, and the urgency of the delivery meant I was taking routes that were barely fit for a pickup truck, much less a 40-foot trailer. It was a cold, starless night in December, and the air was so dense, and still it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I'd been on the road for about 15 hours, the hum of the fridge unit and the low thrum of the road my only companions. Around 1:30 a.m., I noticed a subtle but persistent pull to the right on the wheel. It wasn't a flat tire, but it felt like a bearing was seizing up or maybe a brake shoe was dragging. I knew I had to pull over immediately. Ahead, I saw a barely visible turnoff for what looked like an old abandoned logging site, just a wide, graveled clearing where they used to stage timber. It was completely deserted, but flat and far enough off the main road. I eased the truck into the clearing, killed the engine, and the resulting silence was immediate and oppressive. The only sound left was the low, steady drone of the refrigerated unit's generator, a mechanical heartbeat in the otherwise dead air. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my work gloves. The air was frigid cutting through my jacket immediately. I knelt down by the tandem axles and started my inspection. I ran the beam slowly along the tires and the wheel hubs, checking for any obvious signs of failure. The only thing I noticed was that the ground felt strangely soft, almost spongy under the heavy gravel, and the air held a faint, earthy smell of rot, even through the cold. I had just found a small, hairline crack in the rim of the outer right tandem tire, the likely cause of the pull, and was reaching for my phone to call dispatch when the sound started. It was a high, thin scrape originating from the back of the trailer, right near the rear refrigeration unit. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was unnerving because it sounded deliberate. It wasn't the creak of the metal cooling or settling. It was too sharp, too focused. It sounded exactly like a piece of finely honed stone, or, more disturbingly, a piece of sharpened, dry bone being dragged across the thin, corrugated aluminum skin of the trailer. Shack, shack, slow, rhythmic, and impossibly precise. I froze, flashlight pointed at the ground. I told myself it was just a loose wire rubbing against the fan housing of the fridge unit. But the sound was coming from the cargo box itself, well above the frame. I listened closer. The air felt colder now, and the faint, sweet smell of decay intensified, making my stomach churn. The scraping stopped. A long moment of silence followed, broken only by the steady chug-a-chug of the diesel generator. I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding and started to lift my flashlight to look. That's when the scraping started again, but this time it wasn't on the side. It was underneath the trailer, and it was moving. Scrape, scrape. The sound was traveling rapidly along the length of the steel frame rail, moving with an unnatural, fluid speed from the rear axle toward the front. It was directly beneath the main belly of the trailer, the sound vibrating the metal and making a low thrum in the air that I could feel in my teeth. I crouched low, shining the flashlight beam onto the truck. The angle was difficult, but I could see the light reflecting off the underside of the trailer deck and the thick steel crossmembers. Nothing was visible in the cone of light, but the sound was getting louder, closer, moving inexorably toward where I was kneeling near the drive tires. Then it stopped, directly over my head. My neck locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound of the scraping was gone, replaced by an absolute, profound stillness right above the metal deck, inches from my head. I could hear the microscopic pinging of the cold metal, but right above that, I could hear something else, a faint, rapid tapping sound like very long, thin fingers lightly drumming the aluminum floor as if testing the material. And then I smelled it fully, overwhelmingly. It wasn't just rot and earth anymore. It was a musky, metallic stench, like stale swamp water and old, unwashed animal hides, mixed with the distinct copper tang of dry blood. The smell was so thick it felt like I could taste it. Then a tiny shower of cold grit, dust, and maybe a few brittle bits of dried leaf rained down onto my face and neck, kicked up by whatever was standing or lying directly above the gap between the frame rails. My paralysis was complete. I was pinned by the pure, suffocating dread of having something unknown, something inhuman, suspended inches above my skull. I held my breath, terrified that the slightest movement would draw its full attention. Then came the worst sound of all, a sickening, wet, drawn-out slurp. It lasted for 3 seconds, a wet, smacking sound, followed by a quiet, deep sigh. Right above me, a sound of strange, satisfied anticipation. Whatever was up there had just done something wet and messy, and it was waiting for more. The smell intensified to an unbearable degree. I knew I couldn't stay under there. This wasn't an animal. This was deliberate, predatory observation. With a sudden burst of panic strength, I rolled sideways, scrambling out from under the trailer and onto my hands and knees in the gravel. I grabbed the massive iron wrench I had brought out and spun around, pointing my powerful flashlight beam directly into the space beneath the truck, expecting to see a tangle of impossible limbs or a feral face. Nothing. The space beneath the trailer was empty. The sound was gone. The only things visible were the cold, inert steel axles and the black asphalt beyond. But the smell lingered, a poisonous, musky cloud that seemed to cling to the area right around the tandem wheels. I backed away quickly, heart hammering, wrench raised high. I kept the light train on the underside, searching the dark area behind the axles and above the tires. As I pulled my light back to the main frame, I saw it. Scored deeply into the heavy, 1-inch thick steel support beam that ran horizontally just behind the tandem axle was a massive, fresh gouge. It was not a scratch. It was a furrow, maybe 6 inches long, starting thin and ending in a deep, sharp divot that looked like the end of a powerful hook. The metal was curled back at the edges of the cut. This was solid, structural steel designed to withstand tons of force. Whatever made that mark had immense, unnatural strength, and the cut was too high, too far back, and too smooth to have been made by any road debris or machinery I could conceive of. It was at the exact spot where the wet, scraping sound had stopped. The reality hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was testing the metal. It was trying to get into the frozen meat load, or maybe it was just marking its territory, letting the strange metal visitor know it was being watched. I didn't try to call dispatch again. I didn't care about the tire rim. I threw my wrench back into the storage box, jumped into the cab, and slammed the ignition key. The engine turned over reluctantly, but when it finally caught, I put the truck into the lowest gear and crept out of that logging pit. I drove slowly until I hit the main road, and then I drove hard, refusing to look at the side mirror, convinced that whatever had left that chilling signature on my trailer frame was still out there, silent now, but smelling the lingering scent of my terror and the cold promise of the meat I was hauling. I never learned what was under my truck that night. All I knew was that something ancient and hungry in those mountains had the strength to score steel and the patience to wait directly over a terrified man's head, and I had driven right into its feeding ground. The cold dread I felt wasn't from the night air. It was from knowing that the mountain had eyes and teeth, and it was powerful enough to leave a warning I couldn't ignore. Story 5. The rain was relentless, an absolute sheet of cold November misery drumming against the cab of my rig. I was far off the interstate, deep in the hills of eastern Tennessee, driving what my dispatcher had called a scenic shortcut, a narrow, winding county road that felt less maintained and more slowly reclaimed by the surrounding forest. The fog was low and thick, mixing with the downpour to create a claustrophobic tunnel of gray. It was about 11:30 p.m., and I hadn't seen another pair of headlights for nearly 40 minutes. The isolation was intense, the kind that starts to play tricks on your peripheral vision. Then, through the slicing rain on my passenger side, I saw movement. A figure was standing at the very edge of the road, right where the steep, rocky embankment began. It was a man, soaking wet, dressed in dark, frayed hiking gear, a worn waterproof jacket and heavy boots. He was waving his arms weakly but frantically under the truck's headlights, his silhouette distorted and flickering in the downpour. I'm a cautious man, especially in the middle of nowhere, but this wasn't a hitchhiker. This was someone clearly in distress. I slowed the massive truck down slowly, pulling the rig as far onto the gravel shoulder as I dared without risking a slide into the ditch. I hit the air brakes, the hiss of the released air sounding deafening in the sudden silence. I cracked the passenger window down just a couple of inches, keeping the doors locked, the rain immediately spraying a mist into the warm cab. "Hey, are you all right? What happened?" I called out over the drumming rain. He stumbled forward, leaning into the limited space of the open window. His face was obscured by the low brim of his soaked hood and the shadow cast by the cab, but his voice was a deep, grateful rasp, strained and exhausted. "Thank God." He choked out, water streaming off his jacket. "My friends, they need help. Bad fall, deep in the ravine. We were hiking out, wrong trail. No phone service for miles." His breath was coming in desperate, ragged gasps. "Please, can you just take me to the next payphone or a house? I just need to call search and rescue." His story was plausible. Hikers getting lost or injured in these rugged hills happens all the time, especially in foul weather. My initial suspicion started to fade, replaced by a sense of urgency. I was about to reach for the door lock when I asked, "How far down? Are they conscious?" He didn't answer immediately. He was leaning so close to the window, I could smell him now, a deep, pervasive scent of wet earth, stale sweat, and something else, something sharp and metallic like old pennies, mixed with the sickly sweet odor of pine rot. Then his head snapped up. He didn't move it gradually. It was an instantaneous, unnatural jerk upward, like a spring-loaded trap snapping shut. He was no longer looking at me, or at the truck. His gaze was fixed straight into the absolute pitch blackness of the woods on the opposite side of the road, behind my trailer. The rain was still pouring, but in that instant, the ambient light reflecting off the water caught his eyes. What I saw wasn't human. They were enormous, glossy black voids, reflecting no light, completely unnerving in the context of his pale, strained face. They were too wide, too round, and they held an utterly transfixed, vacant expression. He didn't look scared anymore. He looked completely consumed. His mouth barely moved as he whispered, the sound cutting through the rain with chilling clarity. "Oh, they're here now." "Who's here?" I demanded, my hand instinctively reaching for the gear shifter. "Your friends? Are they coming up?" He gave no acknowledgement of my words. His eyes didn't flicker, remaining locked on the darkness. He straightened up from the window with a sudden, impossible speed. He was taller than he had appeared, leaning in, long-limbed and bony. Then, instead of opening the door or asking me to wait, he took one giant, purposeful step backward. He planted his foot firmly on the muddy gravel, turned on the ball of that foot, and launched himself into a dead sprint. It wasn't a normal run. It was a terrifying blur of motion, a silent, lightning-fast dash straight toward the impenetrable, briar-choked tangle of the thick forest embankment. He covered the 15 feet to the tree line in just 3 impossibly long strides. I heard no breaking branches, no heavy footsteps on the leaves, just a whisper of friction as he vanished, swallowed instantly by the blackness and the rain. It was a movement too efficient, too fast, and too silent for a tired, injured hiker or even an Olympic sprinter to execute in that terrain. It was the desperate escape of an animal, or was something even worse. I didn't wait to see if his friends would follow. The sight of those black eyes, the unnerving whisper, and that silent, explosive sprint confirmed every dark folk tale about these hills. I threw the gear lever in a drive, slammed the accelerator to the floor, and the engine roared. The back tires spun wildly on the slick asphalt for a heart-stopping second before finally catching purchase, and I peeled out, sending a plume of water and gravel back into the woods where the man had disappeared. As I drove, my heart hammering against my ribs, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those black eyes reflecting in the red glow of my taillights. I tried to rationalize it. A feral person, a drug addict, a prank, but none of it explained the unnatural speed, the silent vanishing act, or that chilling flat statement. "Oh, they're here now." He wasn't afraid of them. He seemed to be acknowledging their presence, almost surrendering to it. The fear was cold and deep, settling in the pit of my stomach. I realized that the man hadn't been asking me for help for his friends. He had been baiting me. He needed a distraction, a brief moment of light, sound, and a plausible story to draw me in close enough for them to approach. He wasn't running from them when he sprinted into the woods. He was rejoining them, or perhaps being violently recalled. I drove until the rain finally broke and I reached a brightly lit stretch of freeway miles away. When I finally pulled over to catch my breath, the cab smelled faintly of that strange, metallic musk the man had carried. I had to wipe down the area around the passenger window, feeling a sickening sense of contamination. I never reported the incident. How could I? I saw a man with black eyes who ran like a ghost into the woods after saying they had arrived. But the memory remains a heavy, dark shadow in my mind. The thing that haunts me most wasn't the look in his eyes or his impossible speed. It was the deep, raw gratitude in his voice when he first asked for help, and the sickening sense that whatever he was helping wasn't human, and it needed me, or someone like me, to complete its sinister, desperate escape. I often wonder what those friends looked like, wading deep in the ravine, and what they did to the man who asked for assistance before disappearing into the silent Appalachian night. I'm just thankful I didn't unlock the door. Story 6. The run was a straight shot from Salem to a distribution center just outside Roanoke, Virginia, an easy drive usually, but the hours were brutal. I was on the road around 4 a.m., deep in that thick, pre-dawn darkness where the world feels suspended in cold isolation. The road, a quiet Tulane State highway that snaked through the foothills, was empty. The forest was dense, pushing right up to the shoulder, and the air was still and sharply cold, carrying the damp scent of frozen earth and pine. I was focused on my lane markers, running on stale coffee and adrenaline, when my headlights picked up a disturbance ahead. It looked like a dark, strangely uniform heap right in the middle of my path. My initial, reflexive thought was that it was a pile of trash, maybe a mattress that had fallen off a truck, or a very large deer carcass. I slowed the rig down slowly, easing off the gas, ready to swing wide into the opposite lane. As I drew closer, my lights clarified the scene. It wasn't trash or a deer. It was a massive, disturbing pile of feathers. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them of every color you could find in a common Appalachian bird. Dark black, mottled brown, and stark white, all heaped together in a dome shape that was easily 4 feet across and perhaps 2 feet high. It was placed with an unsettling precision, right on the double yellow line. The volume and variety of feathers suggested a massacre had taken place, but there was no visible blood spatter on the surrounding road, and the pile itself was unnaturally neat. I stopped the truck about 20 feet back, putting the transmission in neutral, the idling engine the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I peered through the windshield, utterly perplexed. Why would a pile of feathers be so neatly arranged and so massive? It was then I noticed the heap wasn't completely static. A shiver ran through the feathers. It wasn't the wind because the air was dead still. It was a subtle, internal movement, a slow, almost imperceptible shifting, as if something buried underneath was adjusting its position. The dome of feathers seemed to rise and fall slightly, like a shallow, uneasy breath. My blood turned cold. I suddenly realized that the feathers weren't the remains of a meal. They were a deliberate, organized blanket. I could faintly discern the contour of a body beneath the mass, long and narrow, yet thick in the center. It looked like something huge, stretched out and perfectly camouflaged, using the debris of its past hunts as a shroud, waiting in absolute stillness on the road. I didn't want to get out. I didn't want to get closer. My primal instinct was screaming at me to reverse, but I knew if I threw the truck in reverse, the shift and the noise would announce my fear. I decided to make noise first. I reached for the air horn, depressing the button for a long, piercing blast. The sound was a raw, aggressive shriek in the quiet darkness. It tore through the air, vibrating the cab and the surrounding woods. The pile didn't jump or run. It exploded. It wasn't a scatter. It was a detonation. The feathers shot straight up into the air in a silent, suffocating cloud that momentarily blocked my view of the woods and the road beyond. Hundreds of black, white, and brown flakes rained down, spinning and tumbling. But when the cloud of debris cleared, one area remained untouched. A perfectly cleared circle in the center of the road, right where the highest point of the pile had been. And there, pressed into the cold, damp asphalt, was an impossibly clear, wet imprint. It was a track, unlike anything I had ever seen. It was roughly the size of a man's bare foot, but far more elongated, and it ended not in 5 human toes, but in 4 wickedly sharp, pointed indentations, talons curved and deep. The shape was bird-like in its ferocity, but the size was utterly terrifying, a crushing blend of an apex predator and something upright and impossibly tall. And most chillingly, the imprint was stained deep, glossy red. A puddle of fresh, wet blood had been pressed out of the impact zone, glistening vividly in my headlights. This thing hadn't just been resting. It had been holding its position, completely motionless, relying on its stillness and the natural debris to blend with the asphalt, waiting for a passing creature, or a passing truck, to become a fatal mistake. The horn blast had made its presence known, forcing it to vacate its cover in an explosive, silent maneuver. I didn't see the creature itself, but the explosion of feathers meant it was now moving, and its silence was more terrifying than any roar. It had to be massive to displace that many feathers in one move, and it had to be incredibly fast to be gone from the exact spot, so quickly that my high beams caught nothing but the settling snow of feathers. The realization that I had just disrupted a perfectly camouflaged predatory trap, a living ambush right in the middle of a major road, sent a bolt of pure panic through me. I slammed the gear lever into drive and buried the accelerator against the floorboard. The truck lunged forward, tires momentarily spinning over the bloody imprint. I felt a sickening, almost sticky pull as the heavy wheels crossed the spot. I didn't breathe until I had cleared mile marker 12, then 13, pushing the engine to its limit, the trailer rattling violently. I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The cloud of feathers behind me was slowly dissipating, swirling around the spot where the dark footprint lay. As the fog began to creep back in, I saw a final, subtle movement at the edge of the tree line to the right. A flicker of motion, tall and thin, like a shadow briefly detached from the trunks, watching me speed away. I drove until the sun was fully up, not stopping, shaking uncontrollably. When I finally pulled into the well-lit safety of the distribution yard, I got out and walked immediately to the tires that had rolled over that spot. There was nothing visible, no blood, no feather fragments, just cold, wet rubber. But when I went to fuel up later that day, I found something. Scraped deep into the black plastic of the lower front fender, just above the tire, was a faint, shallow scratch, a perfect crescent shape. And stuck fast to the inside edge of the crescent, caught in the plastic furrow, was a single, long, stark white feather, impossibly clean, vibrating faintly in the draft. It was a chilling reminder that whatever had been resting in that pile was not just a ground predator. It was something with the anatomy of a bird, the size of a man, and the dreadful patience of the ancient Appalachians, and it had been close enough to tag my truck as I drove over its gruesome footprint. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew its silence was its deadliest weapon, and its stillness was merely the prelude to an explosion of pure, savage hunger. Story 7. The location was deep within the Tioga State Forest, Pennsylvania, a stretch of territory that feels less like parkland and more like a primordial, sprawling wilderness. I was on a late-night haul, moving heavy machinery, and I'd finally reached my mandatory break time. It was the absolute dead of night, the kind of blackness that feels less like the absence of light and more like a physical presence pressing in on all sides. I found a barely used access road, pulled off far enough to be invisible from the main highway, killed the engine, and settled in for a restless 6 hours. The only sound was the familiar, gentle ticking of the cooling engine block, a sound that always felt comforting until it stopped. I was finishing up my logbook, detailing the mileage in hours, when I glanced at my cell phone. It was sitting on the dash, showing the time, and, predictably, the small circle with the diagonal line indicating zero service. Out here, deep in the mountains, a signal was a non-existent luxury. I sighed, closed the logbook, and was reaching to turn off the cab light when the silence was abruptly shattered. My phone rang. It wasn't a notification ping. It was a full, loud, insistent ring. I stared at the screen, bewildered. The service indicator was still showing 0 bars, but the screen displayed incoming call and unknown number. My heart gave a startled jump, less from fear and more from the sheer impossibility of the situation. Who was calling me? And how was the call even connecting? Against every ounce of common sense, curiosity, and that deep-seated human need to answer a ringing phone, I snatched it up and hit the answer button. Hello. My voice sounded loud and strained in the confined space. The line was dead silent for a long moment, a silence that felt different from static or a dropped call. It was a silence that felt heavy, intentional, like the caller was listening to my very breath. Then a voice started. It was a dry, cracking whisper, devoid of accent or inflection, sounding like old paper being rubbed together, amplified somehow in the earpiece. It didn't acknowledge my hello. It simply began to speak, reciting what sounded like directions. Mile marker 127.5. Turn west onto Old Sawtooth Road. Ignore the county warning sign. Proceed 3.4 miles to the double-blazed maple. I frowned, immediately disturbed. The directions were far too specific, using decimal points for distance on old logging trails where mileage markers hadn't existed in 50 years. Old Sawtooth Road? I'd never heard of it, and I'd driven these hills for years. "Who is this?" I asked, keeping my voice low and firm. "You have a wrong number. I'm driving. I can't." The voice didn't stop. It simply continued its relentless, dry recitation, as if I hadn't spoken at all, or as if it were a pre-recorded message that could hear me but chose to disregard me. "At the Maple, take the northern fork. That road is designated abandoned mine trail. Follow the water runoff. Note the smell of sulfur." A cold, deep chill began to seep into my chest. The feeling that this was not a prank, not a wrong number, but something deeply intentional started to take root. This was a road map, a meticulously detailed path leading me, mile by mile, deeper and deeper off the known track, toward an abandoned trail that sounded dangerous and impossible to navigate in the dead of night. "Listen to me," I hissed, leaning forward. "Stop. This is harassment. Who are you? How are you getting reception here?" The voice paused. For the first time, its recitation broke. The dry, brittle whispering stopped, and there was another moment of that charged, unnatural silence. Then the tone changed. Completely. The sound that came through the receiver was no longer a whisper, but a high-pitched, incredibly realistic cry. The long, distressed bleat of a white-tailed doe. The sound of a large deer in sudden, extreme pain. It was so perfect, so animal, that I actually flinched and glanced out the window, expecting to see a deer caught in the trees. The cry lasted maybe 3 seconds, ending in a chilling, guttural rattle. Then, the sound abruptly cut off, replaced by something altogether more horrifying, a deep, wet, squelching noise. It was a chewing sound, guttural, slow, and sickeningly wet, like something with powerful jaws grinding down on bone and soft tissue. It was a sound of consumption, of satisfied, dark hunger. I could hear the faint, sickening snap of something hard being crushed, followed by a heavy, satisfied slurp. It lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. I could feel my face grow slick with cold sweat. The phone pressed hard against my ear. That sound, that sheer animalistic feeding, was utterly primal and devoid of humanity. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a recording. It was real, and it was happening on the other end of a phone line that shouldn't even exist. I dropped the phone. It clattered against the dashboard, sliding down onto the floor mat. The chewing sound continued, muffled but still terrifyingly distinct. I scrambled, fumbling the door open. I needed air. I needed distance. I lunged for the phone on the floor, grabbing it and ripping the back casing off with shaking hands, tearing the battery out, and throwing both pieces onto the passenger seat. The second the battery disconnected, the chewing stopped. The silence rushed back in, but it was ruined now, contaminated by the memory of that sickening sound. I stood outside the cab for a full minute, breathing in the cold, clean pine air, trying to purge the metallic stench of fear and the phantom smell of old blood that seemed to cling to the cabin. After my hand stopped shaking, I climbed back in, flashlight beam sweeping the inside. I looked down at the phone and the battery I had ripped out. The phone screen, which had been perfectly fine, was now completely spiderwebbed with cracks, black and dead. The battery casing was bent and warped, strangely hot to the touch. But the most disturbing detail was the air inside the cab. It felt profoundly heavy, thick, and stale, like the atmosphere of a closed cave. It carried that awful, musky smell, only magnified like old, dust-choked fabric mixed with something acrid and deeply, unnervingly biological. The smell of something that hasn't seen sunlight or clean air in centuries, something that consumes only darkness and raw, wet meat. It felt profoundly like the breath of something ancient, something that had been waiting for the line to connect. I didn't sleep that night. I locked every door, pulled the heavy blackout curtain across the windshield, and sat there, rigid, listening to the vast, mocking silence of the forest. I kept the light off, terrified that the glow might invite another kind of connection. I finally started the engine at 5 a.m., 2 hours before my alarm, and drove straight through until I hit the industrial outskirts of Harrisburg. I threw the phone and the battery into a dumpster at the first brightly lit rest stop I found. I never did figure out how that call bypassed the zero-service barrier, or why that dry voice was trying to lure me down abandoned trails toward the smell of sulfur and the sound of something feeding. But I know that whatever was speaking wasn't looking for help. It was looking for company, or maybe looking for its next meal. And the chilling sense of that stale, hungry breath lingering in the cab, filling the space where the phone had been, told me that whatever the call connected me to, it was something that knew the secret paths of the mountain and had been starving for a very, very long time. Story 8. It was the kind of warm, deceptive evening that October sometimes throws at you in the mountains. I was running a load through the Cumberland Plateau in eastern Tennessee, heading toward Knoxville, and the air was still and humid, the perfect conditions for a long, quiet night of driving. I've been on the road since mid-afternoon, and around 1 a.m., I decided to pull off onto a paved but clearly defunct roadside park to check the pressure on my rear right inner tire. It had been running slightly hot on the sensor. The park was just a wide, circular pull-off with a concrete picnic table and a sign riddled with bullet holes. It was completely surrounded by thick, closed-set woods and completely isolated. I killed the engine, and the massive truck settled with a series of metallic groans and hisses. The sudden silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the low, insistent drone of insects in the trees. I grabbed my air gauge and flashlight, hit the door latch, and swung myself out onto the warm, damp asphalt. The moment my feet touched the ground, I was hit by an overwhelming, intrusive smell. It was the unmistakable, heavy aroma of a wood fire, but not the clean, comforting scent of burning oak or pine. This was acrid and sickening. It smelled of green wood being improperly burned, mixed with the sharp, fatty odor of burning meat. Not barbecue, but something worse, something raw and singed. It was the smell of a bonfire built with malice, a cooking fire that had gone terribly, disgustingly wrong. I stopped dead next to the cab, peering into the oppressive darkness. I swept my powerful flashlight beam across the trees, up the hillside, and around the entire clearing. There was no visible smoke, no plume, no faint orange glow, and no sound of crackling flames. The darkness was absolute. A fire this size, one producing a smell this intense, would have to be generating a visible glow, even through the dense canopy. I pulled my jacket tighter, a cold wave of unease washing over me. The smell was so concentrated it felt like I could taste it, a greasy film clinging to the back of my throat. I cautiously began to walk along the side of the trailer toward the rear axle, where the problematic tire was. As I moved, the smell intensified, becoming almost suffocating near the center of the trailer, as if the heat source was directly beside me in the woods. I knelt down beside the tires, shining the light on the valve stem, trying to focus on the task, but my mind was spinning. The sheer lack of evidence for the smell was deeply unsettling. And then the sound began. It was a low, dry, rapid sound originating from the trees immediately on the passenger side of the truck, maybe 15 feet away. It wasn't a roar or a grunt. It was a rhythmic, incredibly fast chittering, a continuous clicking noise that sounded like hundreds of tiny, hard objects hitting against each other, or maybe like chattering teeth that were impossibly dry and brittle. It wasn't the sound of an insect swarm. It was mechanical, driven, and distinctly unnerving. I straightened up immediately, dropping the air gauge. The smell of burning meat and singed pine seemed to swell around me, choking the air. The chittering sound intensified, becoming frantic, a rapid, hungry clicking that traveled along the tree line, sounding less like one animal and more like a dense, agitated swarm moving in concert. I stood there, paralyzed, my flashlight beam stabbing uselessly into the impenetrable blackness of the forest. The chittering stopped as abruptly as it began, replaced by a sudden, total silence, heavier and more focused than before. I was aware of the silence pressing in, and I was aware of the heat of that sickening, unseen fire. I slowly turned the beam of my flashlight from the ground and pointed it toward the noise. The light vanished into the void. I waited for a few seconds, holding my breath, telling myself it was a massive flock of cicadas, anything but what my mind was suggesting. It was then I saw it. About 10 feet up in the air, nestled among the high branches, a faint, tiny red glow appeared. It was too small to be a firefly, too steady to be a reflection. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it was two tiny vertical slits of light, unmoving, perfectly parallel and utterly fixed on me. They weren't warm like embers. They were cold, precise points of sharp, reflective red, like the reflection off a predator's eyes, only 10 feet off the ground and unnaturally close set. The knowledge that I was being watched, from a height that precluded any common animal, by something that was utterly still and silent, while simultaneously surrounded by the smell of burning flesh, broke my resolve. The creature wasn't moving. It was simply waiting, the tiny red lights serving as a dreadful punctuation mark to the awful atmosphere. I didn't try to look higher. I didn't try to identify the creature. The combination of the unholy smell, the frantic chittering, and the silent, high watchfulness was too much. This was a trap, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I didn't run. I took 2 deliberate, slow steps backward, maintaining eye contact with the 2 red slits, which never once blinked or shifted their focus. When I reached the door handle, I ripped the cab door open, threw myself back inside, slammed the door shut, and immediately locked it. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there, fumbling with the keys, watching the red glow in the side mirror. It remained fixed, unmoving, like an ember waiting for the right moment to flare. I fumbled the key into the ignition, my hands slick with sweat. As the massive diesel engine roared to life, shattering the stillness, the red glow vanished instantly, snuffed out as if by sudden, internal command. I slammed the truck into gear and drove out of that clearing, tires spitting gravel onto the deserted picnic table. I looked in the side mirror, watching the treeline recede, and as I picked up speed, the overwhelming, sickening smell of burning meat and singed pine vanished completely and totally. But it was replaced. The cab was instantly filled with a new, horrifying odor, a thick, overpowering stench of decay, feces, and sulfur, sharp and acrid, like rotten eggs and spoiled meat left in the sun for weeks. It was a powerful, chemical-like miasma that made my eyes water and my stomach heave. This wasn't the smell of a localized fire. This was the smell of the thing itself, the creature's true, natural odor, released in frustration or anger as I drove away. I drove for 50 miles, opening the windows, trying to blast the air out, but the stench clung to the vinyl and fabric of the cab, thick and poisonous. It was a suffocating layer of pure, elemental decay. I kept checking my rearview mirror, convinced the creature was following, a towering silhouette wreathed in the stench of sulfur. When I finally hit the outskirts of Knoxville and the scent finally began to fade, replaced by the normal, polluted air of the city, I realized what had happened. I hadn't interrupted a fire. The creature hadn't built one. The smell of burning meat and pine was a lure, an atmospheric effect, a deliberate, localized projection designed to draw me out of the safety of the truck and into its waiting, chittering silence. And when the lure failed, it left me with its signature, the true, rotten smell of its existence, a grim promise that I had been near something that consumes and decays, something ancient and terrible that resides just beyond the firelight in the Tennessee hills. I still smell it sometimes, late at night when the air is cold and too still. It's a terrifying reminder that the Appalachian darkness doesn't just hide things, it cooks them. Story 9. The location was a rarely used power line easement deep in the hills of West Virginia, somewhere between Charleston and Beckley. I've been driving a flatbed loaded with steel beams, an exhausting 12-hour run, and I needed my mandated break. Finding a place large enough to park a 70-foot rig off the road is always tough in the Appalachians, so when I saw the clearing beneath the high-tension lines, a wide, graveled path with absolutely no one around, I took it as a blessing. I parked the truck dead center in the clearing, nowhere near the woods, figuring the isolation under the buzzing power lines was the safest spot. The nearest tree line, dense and dark, was a good 50 feet away on either side. I finished my logs, set my alarm for 3 a.m., and settled into the sleeper cab. I was asleep within minutes, the hum of the overhead power lines a low, ambient drone that usually felt strangely comforting in the dead quiet of the mountains. I woke up suddenly, violently, pulled from a deep sleep by a sound that didn't belong. Initially, my sleep-fogged brain registered it as heavy rain, a rhythmic, loud thump, thump, thump on the narrow metal roof of the sleeper cab directly above my head. But the sound was too loud, too heavy, and too uneven to be water. It was a weighted, deliberate walking sound. Thump, 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 thump. I lay rigid in the darkness, listening. The rhythm was unnatural, a pair of heavy impacts followed by a brief, dragging scrape, like a broken limb being pulled. And the weight was immense. Every time the thump hit, the entire suspension of the massive tractor-trailer groaned and creaked, protesting the unexpected pressure. This wasn't a raccoon or a coyote. This was something impossibly heavy, walking on the curved, metal strip of roof barely 3 feet above my face. I sat up slowly, silently, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. I knew where I was parked. I was 50 feet from the nearest climbable tree. There was no way for anything to have simply climbed onto the roof of the cab. And even a bear wouldn't be able to achieve this kind of deliberate, measured pacing. It was moving back and forth from the front of the sleeper toward the windshield and back again, its path confined to the narrow, 6-foot-long strip of roof. It was pacing, and it was listening. I reached for my phone, which was charging on the little side shelf. My hand was shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to grip it. I didn't dare turn on the screen light immediately. I held my breath, listening to the terrifying rhythm directly overhead. The air in the cab suddenly felt thin and cold, despite the heating being off. Thump, thump, scrape, thump. The sound was sickeningly close, vibrating through the thin metal skin of the ceiling, making my ears ache. I slowly brought the phone up, shielding the screen glow with my blanket, and managed to unlock it, navigating silently to the camera app. I wasn't sure what I intended to record, a noise, a shadow, but I felt a desperate need for proof, for something tangible to anchor the horror. As I did this, the walking stopped. Instantly. The sudden silence was deafening, the oppressive quiet amplifying the low, high-pitched whine of the power lines overhead. A sound I hadn't even noticed before, but which now felt like a desperate electronic scream. I waited rigid. It was listening to the slight rustle of my blanket, the ragged sound of my own breathing. I imagined the thing, whatever it was, standing perfectly still, its bulk pressing down on the narrow strip of metal inches above my skull. Then a long, impossibly thin shadow dipped down over the top edge of my windshield, flickering briefly in the weak ambient light filtering through the window curtain. It was too long, too sharp, and moved with a horrifying skeletal grace. And then I heard the breathing. It was a rapid, rasping inhale, a wet, desperate sound right outside the windshield glass, followed by a slow, deliberate exhalation. It was huge, heavy breathing, but it was coming from a height that put the breather's mouth directly at the top corner of the glass, level with the roof. It sounded like something with massive lungs was trying to sniff the air, taking in my scent from outside. I pressed myself flat against the mattress, the phone slipping from my grip, forgotten. I closed my eyes, praying that if I remained still, it would move on, thinking I was just another piece of cold metal. A faint, awful scraping noise came from the outside of the windshield, right above the passenger side wiper. It was the sound of a long, brittle nail or talon being slowly dragged across the thick glass, a sound of testing, of measuring. And then it happened. A drop of liquid splattered onto the windshield directly in front of my face. It wasn't water. It was thick, viscous, and dark, and it hit the glass with a distinct plop. It immediately began to slowly run down the glass, streaking darkly in the faint light. It was warm. I could feel the residual heat radiating off the glass. It looked like saliva, or something thicker, expelled onto the windshield from the thing's massive height. That single drop of hot, thick liquid, a physical contaminant from a towering, silent creature, shattered my ability to remain frozen. I wasn't just being watched, I was being marked. I launched myself up, fumbling for the ignition key. I didn't dare look up through the small, high window into the cab, terrified of what I might see staring back at me from the roof. I jammed the key in and cranked the ignition. The engine roared to life, a desperate, defiant sound that broke the night. I slammed the gear lever into drive, releasing the air brakes with a violent panicked hiss. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting gravel. As the truck moved, I heard it. A sudden, enraged, high-pitched shriek that was raw and absolutely unearthly. It wasn't a human scream or a bear's roar. It was a frantic, agonizing cry of profound loss and rage, the sound of something huge being denied its prey at the very last second. I kept my foot on the accelerator, pushing the 70-foot rig faster than was safe in the low visibility. I watched the side mirror, seeing the clearing and the power lines recede. I couldn't see the creature, but the sound followed me, a series of crashing, heavy impacts in the woods to my right, accompanied by the desperate, continuous shrieking, getting fainter as I sped away, but full of such raw hunger it made my skin crawl. It sounded like something was stumbling through the trees, parallel to the road, trying to keep pace with the moving truck. I didn't slow down for 20 miles until I reached a busy, late-night gas station. I pulled in and finally killed the engine. Trembling, I grabbed my towel and went out to clean the windshield. The drop of fluid was still there, now cooling and thickening on the glass. It wasn't clear. It was a dark, oily, reddish-brown. But what chilled me to the soul was what I found on the flat, exposed metal ridge above the windshield. Scuffed into the dust were faint, deep impressions, not of paws, but of long, three-toed feet, clearly articulated, running laterally across the narrow metal, showing the impossible grip and weight of whatever had been standing just above my head. And they didn't just walk onto the roof. The scuff marks were concentrated right along the center ridge, the most stable spot, proving it had maintained balance and stillness on a narrow, convex surface, waiting in absolute silence. I never determined how it got onto the roof under the power lines, or why it didn't just smash through the roof to get to me. But I know that the shrieking I heard wasn't just anger. It was the sound of something starving, something that uses the dark skies as its hunting ground, and I drove away convinced that the drop of warm fluid on my windshield was nothing less than a sample of its awful, patient drool, a grim reminder of how close I had come to being its next silent meal. I never, ever park under power lines in the mountains anymore. Story 10. The shift started out normal enough, moving a load of construction materials from Asheville, North Carolina, deep into a remote valley of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was late spring, but up high. The weather was unpredictable. Around 2 a.m., the temperature plummeted and a thick, wet fog rolled in, the kind that doesn't just obscure the road, but seems to absorb all light and sound. I was following my GPS through a winding mountain pass, a ribbon of asphalt barely wider than my rig, and relying heavily on the white line to stay out of the ditch. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled strongly of wet moss and cold stone. I'd been driving in that pea soup fog for what felt like an eternity. The road was a relentless series of sharp, sweeping curves, each one promising a breakthrough into clearer air, but each one delivering only more fog and more isolation. I was completely alone, the only light, the desperate, yellow beam of my own truck pushing back the gray void. The silence was unnerving. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, distant sirens, were completely muffled. After about 40 minutes of this winding ascent, a cold, prickling unease began to settle over me. It started as a vague familiarity. I was rounding a tight, blind curve, and my headlights suddenly illuminated a section of guardrail. It was a stretch of old, rusty steel, dented exactly 3 times in a row, with the same distinctive, reddish-brown stain on the concrete footer. I filed it away, thinking just another curve. 5 minutes later, I took another sharp curve, and there was again, the exact same 3 dents, the same reddish stain. My heart gave a noticeable, sharp thump against my ribs. I must be driving in circles, I thought, despite the road clearly being a single, continuous ascent according to the paper map I had consulted earlier. I slowed the truck, checking the dash clock. I had driven for over 10 minutes between the two sightings. That was physically impossible on a small, tight loop. I dismissed it as fatigue, telling myself all the old, rusty guardrails looked the same up here. I pressed on, fighting the creeping exhaustion, determined to break out of the fog bank. I rounded a third tight bend, and this time, the headlights not only caught the familiar three-dinted guardrail and a reddish stain, but also a cluster of trees right behind it. 3 distinct pine trees, one leaning sharply to the left, the central one massive, and the third with a large, bleached white scar running down its trunk. I had seen those 3 trees before. I knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, that this was the exact same spot. I wasn't tired. I wasn't confused. I was trapped. I had driven forward in a continuous, straight line of travel for perhaps 15 minutes. Yet I was cycling over the same half-mile of road again and again, like a needle skipping on a massive, invisible record. I eased the truck to a complete stop right in the center of the lane, killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. It felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the space. I sat there, staring through the thick fog, my mind racing. There were no side roads, no clear turnoffs, and the guardrail on my right marked a sheer drop. This wasn't a loop I had taken. This was a loop that had been taken around me. The mountain itself felt like it had closed in, using the fog to create an impossible, self-contained geometry. I grabbed my CB microphone, keyed the mic, and shouted, "Any truckers on County 420 northbound? I need a location check. I think I'm stuck." Only the dead, empty hiss of static answered, confirming my total isolation. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to put the flashlight on the dash and focus. I could try to turn the massive truck around, but maneuvering a long trailer on this narrow, fog-slick pass was a death sentence, guaranteed to send me over the edge. My only logical option was to try and break the cycle by moving, but first, I needed to figure out what was holding me here. As I sat there, straining my ears, the oppressive silence was broken. It was a sound that came from the black, thick woods on the left side of the road, just behind the leaning pine tree. It was a voice. It was clear and undeniably human, but unnervingly distorted, as if someone were speaking underwater and the sound had been slowed down by half speed. It wasn't loud, just a flat, deep whisper that carried perfectly through the dense air. It spoke one single word: "Turn." The sound vibrated through the metal of the cab. It was agonizingly slow, drawn out, and utterly cold, devoid of any discernible emotion, yet filled with a chilling, predatory focus. I jumped, physically flinching away from the passenger window. I keyed the CB again, frantic. "Who is that? Get off the line. I need help." The sound didn't come back from the woods. It came from directly beneath me. It was the same stretched, slowed whisper, but it seemed to vibrate up through the seat of my pants, through the brake pedal, echoing inside the truck's chassis. It was the road itself speaking to me, the earth giving the command. "Turn." The sound was insistent, the slowed, deep tone implying immense, agonizing patience. It was telling me to perform the exact maneuver that would strand me, the turn that would leave me hanging over the ravine, putting me totally at its mercy. I realized then that the endless loop wasn't just confusion, it was preparation. It was trying to wear me down, keep me in place until it could compel me into a fatal action. I didn't argue. I didn't question. I knew the moment that voice came from the asphalt itself, that whatever held this piece of the mountain, it wanted me facing the wrong way, ready to fall. I slammed the truck into reverse. The sudden shift broke the silence again. The vehicle groaned, and I hit the gas, backing up blindly into the heavy fog, my head twisted around, watching the limited view out the rear window. I was taking a desperate gamble, hoping that reversing out of the loop would break the spell. As the truck began to roll backward, picking up speed, I heard the sound return from the woods. Not the whisper, but a rapid, scraping sound, followed by a heavy, uneven thump drag hitting the asphalt behind me, tracking my reverse trajectory. It was the sound of something immense and fast that was no longer using silence and geometry to confuse me, but pure brute force to follow. I kept the accelerator down, the trailer tires narrowly missing the dirt shoulder. I passed the 3-dinted guardrail, watching it flicker backward in my high beams. I kept driving in reverse for a full minute, an act of sheer adrenaline-fueled desperation, before finally pulling the air brake and throwing the truck back into a forward gear. When I looked in the side mirror again, the familiar guardrail was gone. The fog still clung to the road, but the trees looked different, the roadside wider, and the overall feeling of claustrophobic stillness had lifted, replaced by a cold, immediate fear that I had just escaped an invisible prison. I drove forward at a terrifying speed, never daring to stop or look back until I reached the next town, where the streetlights and the neon glow of a diner finally broke the mountain's hold. I never did figure out how that stretch of road kept cycling, or what was speaking to me from the asphalt, but I know that the mountain itself was demanding a certain action from me, a turn that would have left me trapped and vulnerable. I escaped its geometry, but the sound of that impossibly slow, deep whisper telling me to turn remains the most terrifying command I've ever heard, a reminder that in the oldest parts of the Appalachians, sometimes the road itself has a voice, and it's not trying to help you find your way home. Story 11. I've been a long-haul trucker for damn near 15 years now, crisscrossing the spine of the Appalachians like it's my own backyard. These mountains, there's something else. Ancient, unyielding, with ridges that cut through the sky like jagged teeth. The roads twist and turn, narrow enough that you feel the trees breathing down your neck, their branches scraping the sides of your rig if you drift too close. In summer, it's all green haze and buzzing insects, but winter turns it into a frozen hell, where the snow swallows everything and the wind howls like a lost soul. I've seen my share of wrecks out here. Trucks flipped over guardrails, drivers pinned in cabs waiting for help that might never come. You learn quick to respect the weather, or it respects you right into an early grave. That night started ordinary enough. It was late December, just after Christmas, and I was running a load of industrial parts from Pittsburgh down to Knoxville. The pay was decent, and I needed it. Bills piling up back home, ex-wife nagging about child support for our boy, who's 12 now and growing like a weed. I'd skip the holiday with him to make this run, promising I'd make it up with a late gift. The guilt gnawed at me as I drove, but that's trucking for you. Always chasing the next mile, the next paycheck. The forecast had mentioned flurries, but by the time I hit West Virginia, it was a full-blown blizzard. Snowflakes the size of quarters hammered the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. Visibility was shot, maybe 50 feet at best, and the road ahead blurred into a white void. I knew the interstate would be a mess, troopers closing lanes for plows, so I stuck to the back routes, the ones locals use but outsiders avoid. Around midnight, the storm really kicked in. My rig, an old Kenworth with over 500,000 miles on her, started slipping on the inclines. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, listening to the chains clank against the ice. No other vehicles out. It was just me and the darkness. That's when I spotted the turnoff, an old Forest Service trail, barely marked by a rusted sign half buried in snow. I'd passed it before on clear days, a gravel path winding into the woods, probably used by loggers or hunters back in the day. It looked wide enough for my 18-wheeler and deep enough to shield from the worst of the wind, better than pushing on and ending up in a ditch. I eased the truck onto it, the tires crunching over frozen earth and underbrush. Branches whipped at the mirrors, and the path narrowed quick, but I found a small clearing about a quarter-mile in, ringed by tall pines bowed under the snow. I killed the high beams to save battery, left the engine idling for heat, and settled in. The cab was my bubble, warm air from the vents, a thermos of black coffee, and a pack of smokes on the dash. Outside, the world was muffled, the snow piling up like a shroud. I cracked the window a hair for fresh air, lit a cigarette, and tuned the radio to kill time. Static mostly, but I caught snippets of a weather report. Blizzard warning in effect. Accumulations up to 2 feet. Travel not advised. No shit. I leaned back in the seat, exhaling smoke that fogged the glass. The trees loomed like sentinels, their trunks black against the white, and the wind whispered through the needles, a low moan that set my teeth on edge. I've always had a thing about these woods, stories from other drivers over CB radio, tales of folks vanishing on hikes, strange lights flickering in the valleys. Old-timers talk about mountain madness, how the isolation gets to you, makes you see things that aren't there. I never bought into the ghost stuff, but there's truth in the loneliness. Out here, your mind plays tricks, filling the silence with what-ifs. The first hour passed slow. I sipped coffee, scrolled through texts from my kid, pictures of his new bike, wishes for a white Christmas. Guilt twisted in my gut again. To distract myself, I tried the radio once more, twisting the dial through frequencies. Country stations faded in and out, then nothing but crackle. That's when I heard it, the whisper. At first, I thought it was interference, maybe a distant broadcast bleeding through. But it wasn't music or talk. It was a voice, faint and raspy, carried on the static like wind through dry leaves. Hunger, never ends. The words slithered into the cab, chilling me more than the cold outside. I sat up, heart skipping a beat. I adjusted the knob, but it came again, clearer. The craving. It takes. Then gone, swallowed by white noise. I turned it off, shaking my head. Fatigue, that's all. I've been on the road 18 hours straight, eyes burning from staring into the storm. Hallucinations happen. I've had them before, shadows darting across the highway that turn out to be deer. I stubbed out the cigarette, closed my eyes, and tried to doze. Sleep came in fits, the idling engine a steady rumble. Dreams blurred with reality. My boy calling for me in the snow, his voice echoing. I woke with a start, sweat on my brow despite the chill. The clock read 2:17 a.m. The snow had eased a bit, flakes drifting lazy now, but the accumulation was deep, maybe a foot already. I needed to piss, so I bundled up. Heavy coat, gloves, boots. Stepping out, the cold hit like a slap, wind cutting through layers. I trudged a few yards from the truck, relieving myself against a tree. The woods were deathly quiet, no animal sounds, just the soft patter of snow. As I zipped up, something caught my eye in the headlight glow, indentations in the powder. Footprints. They started from the tree line, circled the rig in a wide loop, then trailed back into the shadows. Large ones, bigger than my size 12s, with toes elongated, splayed out like they'd been stretched. No tread from boots, bare feet, or something close. My stomach dropped. Bears? In winter? Nah, they hibernate. And these were too human, but wrong. Too long, too deliberate. I followed them with my flashlight, beam shaking in my hand. They looped around the cab twice, as if whatever made them was inspecting, curious, or hungry. Back in the truck, doors locked, I tried to rationalize. Maybe another driver, stranded nearby, checking for help. But no other vehicles, no calls on the CB. I radioed out, "This is Big Red on the Old Forest Trail off 19. Anyone copy?" Static. Then, faint, that whisper again. Not from the radio this time, but outside on the wind. Turned back, craving. I froze, listening. The cab felt smaller, the windows pressing in. I wiped condensation from the glass, peering out. Shadows danced under the trees, branches swaying gently. Or was that movement? Something shifting just beyond the light. I killed the interior lamp, sat in darkness, breath fogging. Hours dragged. I checked the mirrors, see nothing, then doze off only to jolt awake from half-heard sounds. Scrapes against metal, soft thuds in the snow. Around 4 a.m., the real terror hit. The wind picked up, howling through the canopy, and in its gaps, the whispers grew. Not one voice, but murmurs overlapping. Hunger. Takes you join. I clutched the steering wheel, telling myself it was the storm, paranoia from isolation. Then, at the trail's edge, where the path met the woods, a figure emerged. It stepped in the moonlight, filtering through clouds, tall, gaunt, like a man who'd starved for months. Ragged clothes hung off a skeletal frame, skin pale and taut over bones. Hollow cheeks, eyes sunk deep, reflecting the silver light like empty wells. It didn't approach, just stood there, 20 yards out, staring at the cab. Its mouth moved, forming words silent but felt in my chest. Turn back, or the craving takes you. The pulse thundered, skin crawling. Was it a hiker? Lost in the storm? Delirious? But those eyes, vacant, yet piercing like they saw through me. And the footprints matched, bare, elongated. I didn't move, didn't breathe loud. The figure stayed put, mouthing its warning over and over, arms dangling limp. Minutes stretched to eternity. I thought of calling for help, but cell signal was dead out here. The CB crackled once. More static, more whispers bleeding in. Feed, or be fed upon. The figure tilted its head, as if listening too. Then, a scrape, claws on metal, raking the driver's side. I whipped around, but saw nothing. Another scrape, louder, part of my throat. I started the engine fully, lights blazing. The figure didn't flinch, just kept staring. I revved, ready to bolt, but the path was snowed in. I'd risk getting stuck. So I waited, praying for dawn. Light came slow, gray filtering through the trees. The whispers faded with the wind, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. Vanished. No tracks leading away. Just the circles around the truck and fresh scratches on the paint. For deep gouges, like nails dragged hard. Not for branches, too even, too intentional. I cleared enough snow to move, gunned it back to the highway. The storm had passed, roads plowed by morning crews. I made my delivery, but the shakes didn't stop. Told a buddy at the depot. He laughed, said Wendigo fever, old legend of cannibals in the woods, spirits of endless hunger. I don't believe that crap, but 2 years on, I avoid that trail. Stick to interstates, even in storms. But nights like this, when snow falls quiet, I hear those whispers in the wind. Was it a feral man, surviving on scraps, driven mad? Or something the mountains hide, awakened by winter's bite? I don't know. The dread lingers, a cold knot in my gut, reminding me how thin the line is between alone and taken. My boy asks why I quit the back roads. I say it's safer. But truth is, I'm scared what might be waiting next time, mouthing warnings I can't ignore. Story 12. I've been behind the wheel of a big rig for close to 20 years now, hauling everything from steel beams to fresh-cut lumber through the heart of the Appalachians. These mountains aren't just roads to me. They're a living thing, with their fog-shrouded valleys and ridges that seem to shift when you're not looking. The pay's steady, but the solitude wears on you. Hours of nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. My name's Earl, and I've got a wife back in Charleston who worries every time I head out, and 2 kids who think their old man's invincible. But out here, on these narrow forest trails that cut through the wild like forgotten scars, you learn quick that nobody's invincible. The woods have a way of reminding you how small you are, how easy it is to disappear. That evening started like so many others. It was early fall, the leaves just starting to turn that rusty orange, and the air had that crisp bite that promises colder nights ahead. I was coming down from a logging site up near the Monongahela National Forest, my trailer loaded heavy with pine trunks that shifted slightly on the curves. The main highways were clogged with tourist traffic, folks chasing the foliage, so I took the back trails, the ones the locals call the old ways. They're unpaved in spots, rutted from rain, and overgrown with ferns that brush the undercarriage like whispering fingers. Dusk was settling in, the sun dipping behind the ridges, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays. Fog started to roll up from the hollows, thick and milky, muffling the world until it felt like I was driving through a dream. My headlights cut weak beams into it, illuminating twists of vapor that danced like ghosts. I kept my speed low, 30 maybe, the truck groaning over roots and rocks. No rush. I make the depot by morning. About an hour in, nature called. I've been holding it since the last stop, not wanting to pull over in the fading light, but the pressure built until I had no choice. I spotted a small pull-off, a widened spot where the trail met a stream, and eased the rig to a stop. The engine ticked as it cooled, and I stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. I walked a few yards into the underbrush, away from the road, unzipping as I went. That's when I saw the carvings. On the trunk of an old oak, bark peeled back fresh, like it had been done recent. Symbols scratched deep. Elongated figures, stick-thin with what looked like antlers branching from their heads. They weren't art, more like warnings, crude and frantic, as if whoever did it was in a hurry. I stared for a moment, flashlight from my pocket playing over the lines. Hunters marking territory, kids messing around, but something about them unsettled me. The way the figures seemed stretched, hungry-looking. A chill ran up my spine, unrelated to the cooling air. I finished quick, shook it off as paranoia, and headed back to the cab. The fog had thickened, swallowing the trail ahead and behind. I climbed in, locked the door out of habit, and fired up the engine. The headlights pierced the mist, but visibility was down at 20 feet. As I pulled back onto the path, the CB radio hissed to life. I always keep it on Channel 19, the trucker's frequency for company or warnings about cops or wrecks. At first, it was just static, the usual white noise. Then a voice broke through, garbled, distorted, like it was coming from far off or through interference. Wendigo's near, don't stop, it hungers. The words hung in the cab, clear enough to make my skin prickle. Wendigo. I'd heard the term in old stories swapped at diners. Native legend about a spirit of famine, a cannibal curse that turns men into monsters in the winter woods. But this was fall, and legends are just that. Probably a prank, some bored driver with a sick sense of humor, or maybe atmospheric skip bouncing a signal from miles away. I grabbed the mic, keyed it. This is Timber Hauler on the Ridge Trail. Say again. You need help. No response, just more static. I chuckled to myself, trying to shake the unease, but my eyes flicked to the mirrors more than usual. The fog pressed in, and the trail felt narrower, the trees closer. I pushed on, the rig lumbering over uneven ground. The carvings nagged at me, though, those stretched figures antlered and gaunt. My mind wandered to tales I'd heard from old-timers. Folks going missing in these hills, search parties finding camps abandoned, food uneaten but signs of struggle. Feral people, they said, descendants of miners or settlers gone wild, living off the land like animals. Rational explanations for the irrational. But out here, alone, rationality phrase. About 10 minutes later, as full dark descended, my headlights caught a glint in the side mirror. I glanced back, nothing at first. Then there was eyes, pale, unblinking, reflecting the red of my taillights from the tree lean behind. They hovered maybe 5 feet off the ground, steady, not bobbing like a deer's would. I blinked, figuring it for wildlife, a coyote or fox, eyeshine common in these parts. But they didn't move away. They kept pace, weaving through the underbrush parallel to the trail. My speed was 25 now, cautious in the fog, but those eyes matched it, slipping between trees like they knew the terrain intimately. Heart picking up, I accelerated a bit, the truck bouncing harder over roots. The eyes stayed with me, unyielding. Not animal, my mind whispered. Too deliberate, too focused. I checked the rear view again. Still there, closer now. Hard to tell in the mist. A low growl echoed then, not from the radio, but outside, filtering through the cracked window. It wasn't a bear or wolf. More like a stomach rumbling, deep and eternal, the sound of hunger that never quits. It rolled through the cab, vibrating in my chest. I rolled up the window quick, locked it, though what good that did against sound, I don't know. The trail twisted ahead, and I focused on steering, but my glances back grew frequent. The growl came again, closer, like whatever it was had narrowed the gap. Sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the chill. I thought of my family, Mary's face when I left that morning, the kids' laughter echoing in my head. What if I didn't make it home? Stupid thought, but isolation breeds them. I keyed the CB again. Anyone out there? Got something tailing me on the Ridge Trail. Eyes in the woods. Static answered, then faint, that voice again. Don't stop. It hungers. Prank or not, it chilled me. The eyes were still there, pale, orbs cutting through the fog. Then, in a straight stretch, I glanced back and saw more, a silhouette looming in the mirror. Tall, emaciated, arms dangling long like withered branches. It moved jerky, hunched, but upright, slipping through the brush with unnatural grace. Not a bear standing. Too thin, too human-shaped. My breath caught. Feral man? Some poor soul lost to the woods, starve and mad? Or worse, one of those legends made flesh. It didn't charge, just paced, its form blurring in the mist. I hit the gas harder, the rig shuddering as tires spun on loose gravel. The silhouette faded back, but the eyes lingered, watching. The growl swelled, a guttural plea or threat echoing off the trees. Branches scraped the sides like claws reaching. I crested a small rise, the trail dipping into a valley where the fog thinned slightly. Ahead, lights, another vehicle? No, just my imagination. But the path widened, joining a gravel road that led to pavement. I pushed the truck to its limit, lumber shifting dangerously, heart pounding like a drum. In the mirror, the eyes receded, winking out one by one until gone. The growl faded to nothing but wind. I didn't stop until I hit the blacktop, pulling into a lit truck stop an hour later, hands shaking as I gripped a coffee mug. Told the waitress a watered-down version. Thought I saw a bear or something. She nodded, said these hills have their share of strays, human and otherwise. But her eyes said she knew more, had heard similar tales. I made my delivery, went home to hugs and questions I dodged. That was 3 years ago. I've driven that trail since, but never solo, always with a convoy or in daylight. And I checked the mirrors constantly, scanning the tree lean for pale eyes promising famine. Was it a hiker gone wild, carvings as mad art, or something the mountains birth in their depths? A hunger that stalks the lonely? I don't know, and the not knowing gnaws at me, a quiet dread that follows like a shadow. Every dusk drive, I wonder if it'll return, whispering through the fog, reminding me how thin the veil is between the road and the endless woods. Story 13. I've been trucking coal through the Appalachians for nigh on 12 years now, ever since the mines up north started shipping more to the ports down south. It's gritty work, the kind that stains your hands black and your lungs gray, but it pays the bills and keeps the roof over my family's head. My name's Harlan, and I've got a wife named Rita back in Beckley, 2 girls who are growing up too fast. Sarah's 10, always drawing pictures of horses, and little May's 6, with her mother's curly hair and a laugh that could melt snow. They worry about me out on these roads, especially when I take the shortcuts through the backwoods. But time is money in this game, and with quotas tightening, you learn to shave minutes where you can. Those forest trails off the main routes? They're lifesavers on a tight schedule, winding through the ridges like veins in the earth, shadowed by oaks and pines that have stood longer than any man's memory. But they're lonely paths, the kind where cell signal drops, and the only company is the echo of your own engine. That day was midsummer, the air thick with humidity and the buzz of cicadas. I loaded up at a strip mine near Elkins, the trailer heavy with bituminous lumps that shifted on the turns. The sun was high, beating down on the cab like a hammer, and sweat soaked through my shirt. I was running late. A breakdown at the yard had set me back 2 hours, and the boss was riding me hard over the radio. Get it moving, Harlan, or don't bother clocking in tomorrow. Route 19 was the straight shot south, but traffic reports crackled in about a pile-up near Summersville, semis tangled like matchsticks. I knew a detour, an old logging trail that branched off just past the New River Gorge. Locals called it the Overgrown Path, half joke, half warning, because the underbrush claimed more of it each year. I'd used it a handful of times before, always in daylight. Never had issue beyond a bumpy ride. Figured it'd cut 20 miles, get me home before dark. I turned off the pavement, the rig bouncing as asphalt gave way to gravel and dirt. Trees closed in quick, branches arching overhead like a tunnel, filtering the light into dappled patterns on the dash. The air cooled a touch, the forest breath, and I rolled down the window to let in the scent of pine and earth. The path narrowed after a mile or so, ruts deepening from spring rains. I kept the speed steady, 25, eyes on the mirrors for any sway in the load. That's when it happened. A sharp pop, then the hiss of air escaping, the truck listing right like it had been punched. Damn it, I muttered, easing to a stop. Stepped out, boots sinking into soft soil, and sure enough, the rear passenger tire was shredded, metal glinting in the rubber. Nails, dozens of them, scattered across the trail like someone had dumped a box deliberate. Not rusted old ones. These were shiny, new, as if placed there fresh. Sabotage? Kids playing pranks? Or something worse? I'd heard stories of locals spiking roads to deter outsiders, protect their moonshine stills, or weed patches hidden in the hills. Whatever it was, I was stuck. No signal on the phone. CB radio, just static. I grabbed the jack and spare from the cab, sweat dripping as I knelt to work. The sun filtered through leaves, but the air felt heavier here, the cicadas falling silent like they'd been shushed. As I loosened the lugs, something caught my eye on a nearby boulder, half buried in ferns. Etchings carved deep into the stone, crude drawings of skeletal beings, ribs protruding like bars on a cage, limbs elongated and twisted. Arrows pointed deeper into the trees, toward thickets where the path faded. Below them, words scratched rough. Beware the eternal hunger. I paused, tools in hand, staring. Vandalism? Some hiker's art? But the cuts looked fresh, edges sharp, no moss grown over. A chill prickled my skin, odd for the summer heat. I shook it off, focused on the tire, get moving. But as I worked, the temperature dropped noticeably, like a cloud had blocked the sun, though the sky above was clear through the canopy. The air grew colder, unnaturally so, my breaths visible in faint puffs. I glanced around, the woods seeming closer, branches creaking without wind. Then, rustling started, soft at first, leaves crunching underfoot, but no footsteps I could see. Branches snapped, sharp cracks echoing from the underbrush, weight shifting that wasn't animal. Deer? Bear? But it circled, deliberate, moving from left to right, then back. Heart picking up, I worked faster, pumping the jack with sweaty palms. The rustling grew bolder, closer, ferns parting like something pushed through. I grabbed my flashlight from the toolkit. Though daylight lingered, shadows pooled deep in the trees. Swept the beam, but it revealed nothing but mist rolling in low, unnatural for the dry day. That's when the voice came, hoarse, distant, like gravel in a throat. Leave offerings or join the feast. It floated from the woods, not yelled, but carried clear, a whisper that cut through the silence. I froze, wrench slipping from my hand. Who's there? I called, voice steadier than I felt. No answer, just more rustling, now from multiple spots like a group encircling. Offerings? Feast? My mind raced to old tales swapped to truck stops. Feral folk in these hills, descendants of families lost to the mines or wars, living wild, scavenging. Or the Wendigo stories, though I never put stock in spirits. More like madness from starvation, turning men cannibal. But this felt real, the cold seeping into bones, the voice echoing again. Leave or join. I bolted the spare on hasty, nuts tightening uneven but good enough. Shapes flickered at the periphery's edge, thin and hunched, glimpses of pale skin through leaves, breaths fogging the air with a stench that hit me sudden. Decay, like rotten meat left in the sun. Not strong, but cloying, sticking in my nostrils. I didn't look direct. Fear kept my eyes on the task, but they moved, jerky, like folks unused to standing straight. Whispers now, not one voice, but murmurs overlapping, pleas or threats, words like hunger, feed, slithering through the mist. My hands shook as I lowered the jack, the truck settling with a thud. Climbing quick, door slamming, locked it. Engine roared to life, and I peeled out, gravel spraying, trailer fishtailing on the turn. In the mirrors, figures trailed, tall, emaciated, arms swinging loose, fading into the trees as I gained speed. The path blurred, branches whipping the cab, but I didn't slow till pavement hit under the tires. That was 4 years back, and I haven't touched that trail since. Told Rita, a watered-down version. Flat tire, some weirdos in the woods. She made me promise no more shortcuts. The girl sensed something changed. Sarah draws darker pictures now, shadows in the trees. I drive the long ways, interstates mostly, but the dread lingers, a quiet knot in my gut. Was it poachers, high on something, playing games? Or families gone feral? Carvings their mad scripture. Voices allure for the unwary. I question every shadow on the road, every rustle in the night. The warnings felt personal, etched not just in stone but in me, a reminder that these mountains hold hungers that time can't sate. And on summer drives, when the air cools sudden, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next offering to stumble down the overgrown path. Story 14. I've been a trucker for over 25 years, running routes through the Appalachians like they're the back of my hand. These mountains have a rhythm to them. The way the ridges rise and fall, the rivers carving through stone, the forests that swallow everything in green during the day and black at night. I respect them, but I've never feared them. Not really. My name's Tom, and back home in Morgantown, I've got a wife, Ellen, who's put up with my long haul since we were kids, and a son, Jake, who's just turned 18 and talks about joining the military to see the world beyond these hills. They keep me grounded, their voices on the phone a lifeline when the miles stretch too long. But out here, on the forgotten trails, that lifeline thins, and the silence can turn on you like a friend gone sour. It was a late October night, the kind where autumn clings stubborn before winter bites. I'd picked up a load of machinery parts from a factory in Pittsburgh, bound for a warehouse down in Charleston. The interstates were fine, but to shave time, I veered onto the back trails near the Monongahela National Forest. Those paths are old logging roads, rutted and narrow, flanked by towering pines that block out the stars. Fog loves these lowlands, rolling in thick from the river valleys, turning the world into a hazy veil. My rig's headlights cut weak tunnels through it, illuminating twists of vapor that swirled like smoke from an unseen fire. The engine hummed steady, a comforting drone against the quiet, but I'd been pushing hard, 14 hours straight, coffee gone cold in the thermos. Fatigue tugged at my eyes, but home was calling. Ellen had mentioned Jake's enlistment papers over the last call, her voice tight with worry. I wanted to be there, hold her, tell him to think it over. The trouble started subtle. The engine stuttered, a cough in the rhythm, then another. Gauges looked fine, fuel half full, but it sputtered again, the rig losing power on a slight incline. "Come on, girl," I muttered, patting the dash like it was a horse. Pulled over in a small turnout amid the pines, the truck idling rough before I cut it to save gas. Stepped out, boots sinking into damp needles, the fog so dense I could taste it, cool, earthy like breathing in the forest breath. Sounds muffled instantly. My own footsteps dull thuds. The world shrunk to arm's length. Popped the hood, flashlight beam dancing over hoses and belts. Nothing obvious. Maybe vapor lock from the humidity or dirt in the fuel line. I'd seen it before. These old diesels get finicky in the mist. Kneeled to check underneath, the cold seeping through my knees from ground. That's when the silence shifted. At first, it was absolute, the kind that rings in your ears after a loud noise. No crickets, no owls, just the fog pressing in. Then faint and echo a low, guttural moan like a stomach twisting in hunger pangs. It came from the trees, distant but clear, mimicking the ache of starvation I'd felt once on a bad run, days without a proper meal. Shook my head, wind through branches, maybe or an animal in distress. Foxes make weird cries, owls too. But it came again, closer, a drawn-out rumble that vibrated in my chest. Not animal, too human, too pained. I stood, flashlight sweeping the mist, beam diffusing into nothing. "Hello." I call, voice swallowed quick. No answer, just the echo fading, leaving the silence heavier. Worked on the engine, hands greasy, mind wandering to trucker tales swapped at diners. Old boys talking over coffee about Wendigo warnings, legends from the natives, filtered through generations, about spirits born from famine in the woods, driving folks to madness and worse. I'd always dismissed them as yarns to pass the miles, like ghost hitchhikers or phantom lights. Grounded in truth, maybe starvation does strange things, turns men feral. But out here alone, those stories creep in. Fix what I could, a loose clamp on the fuel line, and as I straightened, something crunched under my boot. Bent down, light revealing a bundle by the rear wheel. Small, wrapped in what looked like old hide, tied with twine. Picked it up careful, the material rough, aged, smelling faintly of earth and something sharper like old blood. Unwrapped it slow. Bones inside, small ones, maybe animal, etched with scratches forming words, feed or be fed upon. My stomach dropped. Not fresh, but not ancient. The hide supple, the carvings sharp. Who leaves this? Hunters? Pranksters? Or warnings, like the stories said? The cold deepened then, unnatural for the mild night, seeping through my jacket like icy fingers. Breaths fogged heavier, and the echoes returned. Multiple now, overlapping moans like guts in agony, circling from the pines. Not wind, too rhythmic, too insistent. I tossed the bundle into the brush, heart picking up, and climbed back into the cab. Doors locked, engine cranked. Thank God it turned over smooth. But as I idled, waiting for the gauges to settle, shadows elongated in the fog outside. The headlights cast long beams, and in them, outlines formed, tall, too tall for men, thin and hunched, shifting at the light's edge. Not clear, misplayed tricks, but they moved, jerky, like figures in U's to the open. Feral people? I'd heard whispers. Families lost to the hills. Miners' kin gone wild after caves collapsed, surviving on what they could scavenge. Or hikers vanished, turned savage by isolation. Rational thoughts, but the dread built slow, a knot in my gut. A whisper slithered through then, not from the echoes, but closer, like breath on glass. The trail claims the weak. It came from outside, hoarse, barely audible over the engine, but it pierced. I scanned the windows, saw nothing, but the shadows stirred, outlines drawing nearer. Breaths. Were those breaths, fogging the air beyond the beams. Stench hit faint, decay mixed with hunger, like an empty belly rotting from inside. Panic rose. I threw the rig into gear, tires spinning on needles before catching. The path ahead blurred in fog, but I pushed forward, speed climbing reckless on the ruts. Glances in the mirrors showed shapes trailing, elongated arms swinging, but the mist swallowed them quick. The echoes pursued, though, moans growing louder, more insistent, bouncing off the trees like they followed under the canopy. Drove like that for miles, heart hammering, sweat cold on my skin. The whispers echoed in my head, mingling with the cries, feed, claims the weak, fed upon, rationalized it. Exhaustion, fog playing acoustics, maybe even carbon monoxide from the sputter. But the bundle was real, the bones tangible. Emerged on a pavement, eventually fog thinning as I hit higher ground. Stopped at a gas station near Elkins, hands shaking as I pumped diesel. Told the attendant a half-truth. Engine trouble, weird noises in the woods. He nodded slow, eyes knowing. Monongahela's got its secrets. Folks hear things out there, see things. Best not to linger. Didn't elaborate, but his tone said enough. That was 5 years ago, and I've avoided that stretch since. Stick to the main roads, even if it adds hours. Ellen notices the change. I wake nights sweating, hearing echoes in the wind. Jake enlisted anyway, shipped out last year. Writes letters about deserts far from these woods, but I worry the hunger follows. The dread's a constant companion now, amplifying every shadow on the path, every silence too deep. Was it ferals, starving and mad, leaving warnings to scare off intruders? Or something the forest births in its isolation, a legend grounded in the bones of the lost? I don't know, and the not knowing gnaws, a quiet terror that whispers in the fog. What if next time, the trail claims me? Story 15. I've been hauling loads through the Appalachians for nearly 18 years now, ever since I left the coal mines for something with steadier pay and fewer cave-ins. The roads up here are like old friends, twisting, unforgiving, but familiar in their way. They cut through the Smokies like veins, narrow paths flanked by ancient trees that seem to lean in closer after dark, their branches whispering secrets to the wind. My name's Ray, and back in Gatlinburg, I got a daughter, Emily, who's just hit her teens and thinks her dad's job is the most boring thing ever. My wife, Carla, she worries more, calls me every night I'm out, her voice an anchor in the static. But trucking's in my blood. The solitude suits me, or at least it did until that one run etched a quiet fear into places I didn't know could hold it. It was a crisp autumn night, the kind where the leaves crunch under tires and the air carries a bite that promises frost by morning. I'd picked up a shipment of furniture from a mill in Asheville, bound for a distributor down in Knoxville. The interstate was backed up with construction, orange barrels glowing like jack-o'-lanterns under the floodlights, so I opted for the back trail through the Great Smoky Mountains. Those routes are routine for long haulers like me. Winding, poorly lit, but shorter if you know the turns. No streetlights, just your headlights carving out the path ahead, the forest pressing in on both sides like it's alive and curious. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station fading in and out, and a thermos of Carla's coffee keeping me company. Emily had texted earlier, complaining about school, and I'd promised her a souvenir from the road, a habit to make up for the absences. The cab was warm, the engine a steady rumble, and for the first hour, it felt like any other haul. The trail narrowed as I climbed higher into the ridges, the pavement giving way to gravel that pinged against the undercarriage. Fog started to creep in from the valleys below, thin at first, like smoke from a distant fire, but thickening until my high beams reflected back at me, turning the world milky. I slowed to 20, eyes straining for the next curve. That's when the headlights caught it, a roadside shrine, if you could call it that, pulled over on a small shoulder. It was a circle of antler fragments arranged neat on a flat rock, bleached white and jagged, like they'd been collected over seasons. In the center, a note pinned under a stone, handwriting scrawled rough, "Wendigo watches do not linger." I chuckled to myself, the sound hollow in the cab. Wendigo, old folklore I'd heard around campfires and truck stops, a spirit of hunger from native tales, twisted by hill folk into warnings about starvation in the winters. Probably some kids or hikers messing with passersby, leaving their mark for a laugh. I snapped a quick photo on my phone for Emily. She'd get a kick out of the monster story and ease back onto the trail, the shrine shrinking in the mirrors. But the laugh didn't stick. As I drove on, the branches seemed to reach farther, scraping the sides of the cab like fingers grasping for a hold. Not hard, just persistent, scratch, scratch like nails on tin. I rolled up the window, figuring it for overgrown limbs, but the sound persisted, rhythmic almost, syncing with the truck's sway. The fog deepened, muffling everything outside, and the radio cut to static, no signal this high up. I switched it off, preferring the engine's hum to the white noise. That's when the quiet really settled in, a heavy silence, the kind that amplifies your own breathing, your heartbeat echoing in your ears. I'd felt isolation before, nights where the woods feel endless, but this was different, like the trail was holding its breath, waiting. Miles ticked by slow, the path twisting sharper, forcing me to lean into the wheel. Then, faint at first, a rhythmic thumping started, thud-thud, like something heavy loping alongside, just out of sight in the underbrush. Not tires on gravel. This was organic, muffled by leaves, but steady, keeping pace with my 25. Deer? Maybe bounding parallel, spooked by the lights. But it didn't fade. If anything, it grew bolder, switching sides, left, then right like it was testing. My neck prickled, that old instinct from mine days when the timbers creaked warning. I sped up a touch, but the thumping matched, insistent. Glances in the mirrors showed nothing but fog and shadows, trees blurring. Just wildlife. I muttered, but my grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles whitening. Couldn't shake it. After another mile, the thumping seemed closer, branches snapping now and then like weight-breaking twigs. Pulled over again, this time in a wider spot where the trail hugged a stream, water gurgling faint through the mist. Killed the engine to listen, but the silence rushed in, broken only by the tick of cooling metal. Stepped out cautious, flashlight in hand, a heavy mag light that doubles as a club if needed. The air was cooler up here, damp with fog that clung to my jacket, and the pines loomed tall, their needles dripping. Swept the beam along the roadside, expecting deer tracks or maybe a fallen log. Instead, prints, fresh in the soft earth beside the gravel. Humanoid, but distorted. Feet large, toes splayed unnaturally wide, like they'd been warped by years barefoot. Not boots, bare with claws. No, just elongated nails or maybe deformities. They paralleled the truck for yards, then veered into the undergrowth. My stomach twisted. Hikers? But who walks like that, toes fanned out like roots? A chill wind stirred then, carrying a murmur, low, indistinct, like voices overlapping from afar. Hunger, eternal. Join us. It slithered through the fog, not loud, but clear enough to raise hairs on my arms. Whined through hollows, echoes from the stream, but it repeated closer, join, eternal. I spun the flashlight, beam cutting swaths, but the mist diffused it, revealing only trunks and ferns. Heart picking up, I backed toward the cab, senses sharp. That's when shapes materialized in the undergrowth, gaunt and spectral, flickering at the light's edge. Tall, hunched figures, skin pale where it showed through rags, movements jerky like puppets pulled by strings of famine. Not clear, shadows played tricks, but they shifted, arms dangling long, heads tilted as if listening. Breaths? Faint puffs in the cold, carrying a stench, sour, like unwashed bodies and empty stomachs. Froze there, beam shaking, mind racing. Feral people, stories I dismissed, but truckers swapped them. Families lost to the hills after the Depression, or escapees from old asylums, surviving wild, inbred and desperate. Or hikers gone missing, turned savage by the isolation. Rational, but the dread built a cold weight in my chest. One shape stepped closer, outline sharpening. Emaciated, ribs visible under taut skin, eyes reflecting the light like hollow pits. It didn't charge, just watched, murmuring with the others, words blending into a chant. Hunger, join us. Panic surged. I bolted for the truck, door yanking open, engine roaring to life. Tires spun on gravel, fishtailing as I accelerated away. Mirrors showing shapes receding into the fog, but the thumping resumed briefly, fading as I hit speed. Drove, reckless the rest of the way, fog lifting as I descended, pavement welcoming under the wheels. Stopped at a diner near Knoxville, hands trembling around a coffee mug. Told the waitress a vague tale. Thought I saw squatters in the woods. She nodded, said the Smokies have pockets where folks don't belong, living off scraps, watching the roads. Didn't laugh. Her eyes held knowing. Delivered the load. Headed home to Carla's arms. Emily's questions. That was 2 years back. I still haul, but I avoid those winding routes at night. Stick to lit highways even if it adds hours. The fear lingers quiet, a shadow in my mind. Scanning tree leans for skeletal forms, listening for thumps in the wind. Were they ferals, starved and mad, shrine their ward against outsiders? Or my fatigue conjuring ghosts from legends? I don't know, and the confusion eats at me, a sorrow for the lost souls out there, or maybe for the piece of me left on that trail. Every drive, I wonder if they're still watching, murmuring invitations to join the eternal hunger just beyond the lights. Story 16. I've been driving trucks through the Appalachians for close to 30 years now, ever since I dropped out of community college and figured the open road was better than a desk job that had never come. These mountains are my office. The Blue Ridge Parkway, my main artery, with its sweeping views that turn to fog-shrouded mysteries when the weather turns. I haul supplies mostly, everything from canned goods to hardware for the small towns dotted along the ridges. Pays decent, keeps the lights on for my sister down in Roanoke, who's raising her kids alone after her husband skipped out. Me? No family of my own, just a rig and a miles. Name's Clyde, and I've always prided myself on handling the isolation. Nights where the only light is your headlights, the only sound the engines growl. But there's one trail off the parkway that still twists my gut. A secluded forest path I took once during a storm, and it's left a mark deeper than any scar. That day was late spring, the kind where the green explodes everywhere, but the rains come heavy, turning dirt to soup. I'd loaded up in Asheville with crates of dry goods for a store up near Boone. Flour, sugar, tools folks need when the world feels far away. The sky had been threatening all morning, gray clouds boiling over the peaks, and by afternoon, the downpour hit like a vengeance. wipers slapping full speed, but visibility dropped to nothing on the parkway. Tourists pulled over, hazards flashing, but I couldn't afford the delay. Deliveries wait for no man. Spotted the turnoff. An old service trail, unmarked but known to locals, veering into the woods for a shortcut around a flooded section. Figured it'd offer shelter too, the canopy thick enough to blunt the rain. Eased the rig onto it, tires sinking into mud, branches whipping the mirrors like they were warning me off. The path wound deeper, narrowing until the trees hugged close, ancient oaks with roots bulging like veins. Found a small clearing after a mile, ringed by those giants, their bark scarred from years of storms. Parked there, engine idling to keep the defroster going, rain drumming steady on the roof like fingers tapping impatient. Sat back with a sigh, cracked a soda from the cooler, and watched the water sheet down the windshield. The clearing was peaceful at first. Mossy ground steaming, ferns bowing under the weight. No signal on the phone, CB radio hissing static, but that was normal out here. Folks disappear in these woods sometimes. Hikers, hunters, the occasional drifter. Search parties find gear, but no bodies swallowed by the green, they say. I'd always chalked it up to accidents, bad luck in bad weather. Sipped my drink, mind wandering to my sister's latest letter. Kids doing well in school, but money tight. Guilt nagged. I send what I can, but the road takes its toll. The rain masked everything outside, a white noise that lulled me into dozing, head against the headrest. Woke to a chill in the cab, the kind that seeps slow, unnoticed till your bones ache. Clock said an hour passed, but the storm hadn't let up. If anything, the downpour roared louder. Rubbed my eyes, adjusted the vents. Heat was on, but the air felt colder, like the forest was breathing winter into spring. That's when the sound started, soft at first, woven into the rain's rhythm. Wails, faint and eerie, like wind whistling through hollow bones. Not human, not quite. More like an animal in pain, but drawn out, echoing from the trees. Shook it off as the storm playing tricks, gust through cracks in the rock, or, well, maybe a fox kit caught out. But it persisted, rising and falling, circling the clearing. Peered out the window, wiping condensation, but the fog had rolled in with the rain, turning the world gray and indistinct. The wails grew clearer, mimicking hunger pangs, a guttural twist that made my own stomach clench. Stepped out then, raincoat zipped tight, boots squelching in mud. The downpour soaked me instant, but I needed to check the load. Tarp secure, no leaks ruining the goods. Flashlight beam cut through the sheets, illuminating the oaks ringing the clearing. That's when I spotted the markings, slashes on the trunks, deep gouges forming words, crude but legible. Wendigo's warning. Turn away. They circled the trees, repeated like a mantra, bark peeled fresh, sap still weeping. Wendigo. I'd heard the word in diners. Old-timers spinning yarns over coffee about a famine spirit from native lore, cursing the greedy or the lost to endless hunger. Folklore, I thought kids or cultists leaving their tag. But the cold deepened unnatural, my breaths puffing white as if fall had jumped seasons. The wails sharpened, closer now, no longer masked by rain, rasping, like throats parched from starvation. Heart picking up, I swept the light around the clearing's edge. Nothing at first, just dripping branches and swirling mist. Then a figure appeared, emerging slow from the tree-line, 20 yards out. Emaciated, skin taut over ribs like canvas stretched on frame, clothes ragged and mud-caked. It stood hunched, arms limp, face shadowed, but eyes catching the beam, hollow, unblinking. Gestured silently, hand outstretched, palm up like begging or warning. Mouth moved, forming words soundless over the storm. I froze, rain pounding my hood, mind racing. Hiker? Lost in the woods, starved from days wandering? These hills hide folks, ferals, they call them, families gone wild after hard times, living off scraps, avoiding the world. Or addicts, holed up in the green, madness taking hold. Hey, I shouted, voice cracking. You need help. No response, just that silent mouthing, gesture repeating. The rain eased sudden, from roar to patter, and with it, The figure's voice emerged, a rasping plea, dry as dead leaves. The hunger spreads. It slithered through the air, chilling deeper than the cold. Not loud, but intimate, like whispered in my ear. The wails joined, multiple now, echoing from the woods behind, surround sound of agony. More shapes flickered at the periphery, thin and spectral, but the figure held my gaze, stepping closer, footfalls silent in the mud. Stench hit faint, decay, like meat gone bad, mixed with the earth's rot. Panic surged. I backed toward the cab, lights shaking. "Stay back," I yelled, but advanced slow, mouth working, spreads hunger. Tripped on a root, fell ass first into mud, flashlight tumbling. Scrambled up, door yanking open, slammed it shut, locked. Engine revved to life, wipers clearing the view. The figure was closer, 10 yards now, features sharpening. Cheeks sunken, lips cracked, teeth yellowed. Gestured again, plea turning threat. Tires spun in mud, splattering as I fishtailed out. Mirrors caught glimpses, it following, loping jerky, dissolving into mist as speed built. The trail blurred, branches lashing, but I didn't slow till pavement hit. Rain picking up again like the forest farewell. That was 6 years ago, and I've steered clear of that trail since. Told a ranger buddy. He checked, found the markings faded, no sign of folks. Poachers or squatters, he said, but his eyes doubted. My sister notices the change. I drive less, stay home more, but the unease follows. Nights, when rain drums the roof, I hear those wails, feel the cold seep in. Was it a feral, madness born from isolation, spreading like disease? Or my mind, fatigue conjuring from legends? The sorrow lingers, for the lost out there, hunger eternal, or for the quiet dread that now shadows every drive, whispering that the forest call waits, hidden in the clearings. Story 17. I've been a trucker for over 2 decades now, hauling perishables like produce and dairy through the back veins of the Appalachians. It's a job that suits a man like me, quiet, methodical, with enough solitude to sort through your thoughts without the noise of the world butting in. My name's Vernon, and back in Wytheville, I got a grandson who's just learning to walk, my daughter Karen doting on him while her husband works the shifts at the mill. They rely on my checks to keep things afloat, and I don't mind. It's what keeps me rolling through the nights. But these mountains, they're deceptive. They look peaceful from afar, all rolling ridges and autumn colors. But up close, in the deep woods where the trails go unmarked and the GPS signal flickers out like a dying bulb, they remind you how small you are. How easy it is to get lost, or worse, found by something you shouldn't. That autumn evening started routine enough. The leaves were turning that fiery mix of red and gold, carpeting the ground like a warning not to linger. I'd loaded up in Roanoke with crates of apples and milk bound for a distributor in Knoxville, the kind of run where timing matters, get there late, and the goods spoil, along with your reputation. The main highway was clogged with leaf peepers, tourists snapping photos from their SUVs, so I opted for a shortcut I'd heard about from an old-timer at a diner. Unmarked trail through the laurel thickets, he'd said, sketching it on a napkin. Shaves an hour, but watch the turns. GPS don't work worth a damn. I nodded, folded the paper, and figured it for worth the risk. Dusk was settling as I turned off the pavement, the rig's tires crunching over fallen leaves, the path narrowing quick under a canopy of oaks and rhododendrons. The air cooled, carrying that earthy scent of decay, and my headlights sliced through the gathering dark, illuminating twists of vine and branch that seemed to reach out. The first few miles were uneventful, the truck lumbering steady over ruts worn by loggers long gone. Radio reception faded, leaving me with static and my own humming, old country tunes to fill the void. Karen had called earlier, voice bright over the speaker. "Papa, little Tommy took 3 steps today." I'd laughed, promised I'd swing by soon with a toy truck for him. The warmth of that lingered, but as the trail deepened, the isolation crept in. No other vehicles, no signs of life, just the woods pressing close, laurels thick as walls on either side. GPS blinked out, screen frozen on a blank map, forcing me to rely on memory and the napkin sketch. The sun dipped fully, stars peeking through gaps in the leaves. but the canopy blocked most, turning the path into a tunnel of black. I kept my speed low, 20 maybe, eyes scanning for deer or fallen limbs. That's when the unease started, subtle, a feeling like being watched, the hairs on my neck standing as if the trees had eyes. Rounded a bend, and there it was, the path blocked. Branches piled deliberate, not storm-fallen, straight cuts, arranged in a barricade like someone meant to stop you. My high beams caught the gleam of something white among the wood. "What the hell?" I muttered, easing the rig to a halt. Stepped out, boots sinking into soft earth, the air crisp and still. No wind, no animal calls, just silence. Unnervingly absolute, like the forest had hushed itself. Grabbed my flashlight from the cab, beam playing over the pile. Branches fresh cut, sap oozing, but tied to them were antlers, deer racks, bleached and bound with twine, dangling like ornaments. Etched into the bone, crude scratches forming words. Beware the insatiable. I stared, light steady but hands starting to shake. Poachers? Some backwoods ritual? I'd heard tales at truck stops. Hillfolk leaving signs to ward off intruders, protect their stills or hunting grounds. Laughed it off nervous, but the silence pressed heavier. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting. Just my breathing loud in my ears. Kneeled to clear it, figuring quick work would get me moving. The antlers clacked as I shifted branches, the etching catching my eye again. Insatiable. Mind wandered to old stories, the kind whispered over coffee. Famine spirits in the woods, born from hard winters when folks turned desperate, eating what they shouldn't. Wendigo, they called it, but I never bought the supernatural. More like madness from hunger, turning men feral. These hills hide people, families off the grid, miners' kin gone wild after the cold dried up, surviving on game and secrets. Rational thoughts, but as I worked, the temperature dipped, a chill wind stirring leaves where none had been. Finished heaving the last branch aside, sweat cooling on my brow despite the drop. Stood to catch my breath, flashlights sweeping the tree-line. Shadows stirred, subtle at first, branches swaying without cause. Then, distant, a howl broke the quiet. Long, mournful, like a wolf but twisted, echoing through the thickets. Froze, listening. Wolves aren't common here. Coyotes maybe, but this was deeper, guttural. It came again, closer, morphing mid-note into something human. Famine approaches. Words, clear as if spoken, but warped, like through a throat raw from screaming. Heart jolted, adrenaline spiking. "Hello," I called, voice echoing back mocking. No answer, just another howl, twisting, approaches. Famine. Swept the beam frantic. Nothing, but the shadows deepened, forms weaving between trunks. Tall, spindly, not deer. Upright, limbs long and thin, eyes glinting unnatural in the light, like polished stones catching a spark. Not clear, mist rolling and low, but they moved deliberate, circling the clearing where the barricade had been. Back toward the cab slow, senses screaming. The howls multiplied, overlapping whispers now. Beware, insatiable famine. Not animals. Voices, hoarse and pleading, carried on the breeze that picked up sudden. One form stepped closer, outline sharpening, gaunt clothes tattered, skin hanging loose over bones. Antlers? No, branches tangled in hair, or maybe a headdress. Eyes fixed on me, glinting with that eerie light, hunger or madness. "Who's there?" I yelled, but it didn't respond, just tilted its head, mouth opening in a silent howl. More shapes emerged, spindly and jerky, weaving like they owned the woods. Stench hit faint, musk of unwashed bodies, mixed with rot, like starvation turning inward. Ferals, my mind latched, people lost to the deep woods, descendants of settlers or runaways, living savage, warnings their way of claiming territory. Panic-crested, I bolted for the door, yanking it open, engine roaring as I slammed it shut. Tires spun on leaves, rig lurching forward through the gap I'd cleared. Mirrors caught glimpses, forms trailing, eyes glinting, but the path twisted, losing them in the dark. Whispers pursued, though, carried on the breeze through the vents. Famine joined, insatiable. Accelerated reckless, branches lashing the sides like grasping hands, the trail blurring. Howls faded gradual, but the wind whispered on, words dissolving into gusts. Emerged on a pavement after what felt eternal, heart pounding, sweat cold. Pulled into a gas station near Boone, hands shaking as I gripped a coffee, staring at nothing. That was 4 years back, and I've never taken that shortcut again. Stick to marked roads, even in traffic. Karen asks why I seem distant, why I wake nights staring at the ceiling. Told her a half-truth, close call with wildlife, but the truth gnaws quieter. Those omens, the howls twisting human, the spindly forms, were they feral, starved, and wild, barricades their trap for the unwary? Or my fatigue, legends bleeding into reality from isolation? The sorrow clings, confusion for those hidden in the deep woods, their warnings a cry against the famine that claims them. Every autumn drive, when leaves fall silent and winds stir, I scan the edges wary, listening for whispers that promise the insatiable waits just beyond the lights. Story 18. I've been running winter hauls through the Appalachians for about a dozen years now, ever since the economy tanked and factory jobs dried up back home. It's brutal work. Ice on the roads turns every curve into a gamble, and the cold seeps into everything, making your bones ache no matter how high you crank the heater. My name's Dale, and I've got a family waiting in Harrisonburg. My wife, Linda, who's always got a pot of chili simmering when I roll in, and our 2 boys, ages 8 and 10, who think their dad's some kind of hero for braving the snow. They don't know the half of it. The isolation out there, miles from the nearest town, where the only lights are your own and the stars feel too far to matter. I stick to the main routes mostly, but sometimes, to make time, you take the forest trails, the ones near Shenandoah that wind through national park land like forgotten veins. They're peaceful in summer, but winter? They become something else, a place where the frost claims everything and the quiet can drive you mad. That particular run started like any other freeze-your-ass-off night in January. I loaded up in Winchester with pallets of salt and shovels, essential for the storms pounding the region, bound for a depot down near Waynesboro. The forecast called for flurries, but by evening, it was a steady fall, blanketing the world in white. The interstate was a mess, plows struggling to keep up, so I detoured onto one of those side trails off Skyline Drive, a frost-covered path I'd used a couple times before. It's narrower, iced over in spots, but it shaves an hour if you're careful. My heater was blasting full, fogging the edges of the windshield, and I had the CB on low, listening for chatter from other drivers. Mostly static, though. Not many fools out in this weather. Linda had called earlier, her voice crackling over the phone. "Be safe, honey. The boys are watching the snow, wishing you were here to build a fort." I'd promised I'd make it home by morning, maybe with donuts from that bakery she likes. The guilt of absence lingered, but the road demanded focus. The path slick, trees heavy with snow, branches drooping like they might snap any second. Navigated steady for a while, tires' chains clanking rhythmic against the ice. The verge alongside was snow-dusted, pristine except for the occasional deer track vanishing into the brush. Then, trouble, steam rising from the hood, a hiss like a snake warning. The engine temperature gauge spiked red, overheating despite the cold. "Shit," I muttered, pulling over to the side, the rig shuddering to a stop. Stepped out into the bite, breath clouding instant, boots crunching on frost. Popped the hood, flashlight beam revealing a leak in the radiator hose, probably from the freeze-thaw cycles cracking the rubber. Not a quick fix, but I had tools and coolant in the cab. The air was still, unnaturally so for the wind-whipped ridges, and the snow fell silent, muffling the world. Glanced around the verge, a narrow strip of white between the trail and the dense brush, pines and hardwoods standing sentinel. That's when I saw the messages, scrawled in the frost on a flat rock, finger-traced letters uneven but clear. "Wendigo hungers, flee now." I stared, light playing over the words, melting slightly from my breath. Prank? Some kid's idea of fun? But out here, miles from anywhere, it didn't sit right. Wendigo. I'd heard the name in trucker lore, old native tales of a hunger spirit born from cannibalism in starving winters. Dismissed it as legend, like Bigfoot or ghosts, but the frost made it feel immediate, personal. Shook it off, focused on the repair. Kneeled in the snow, hands numbing as I clamped the hose, poured in coolant. The cold bit deeper, though, beyond the weather, a chill that settled in my gut, making every movement deliberate. Worked for 20 minutes, senses heightened by the quiet. No birds, no distant traffic, just the drip of melting eyes from branches. Then, rustles emerged from the brush, soft at first, like leaves shifting under snow, but evolving, deliberate. Footsteps crunching closer, slow and measured from the tree maybe 30 yards out. Heart picked up, I paused, wrench in hand listening. Animals? Rabbit or fox, foraging? But the steps were heavier, uneven like someone or something picking through the undergrowth. Swept the flashlight, beam cutting through falling flakes, but the brush swallowed it, revealing only shadows dancing. The rustles circled, now from the left, then behind the truck, closing in subtle. Finished the clamp hasty, coolant sloshing, but the footsteps grew bolder, crunch in the frost, accompanied by breaths, labored, visible puffs in the air beyond my light. "Who's there?" I called, voice echoing flat against the trees. No answer, but the cold intensified, my fingers stiffening despite gloves. Then, a gaunt figure materialized at the verge's edge, stepping from the brush like it had been waiting. Cloaked in rags, old coats layered, torn and dirty, its frame emaciated, skin pale and taut where it showed through gaps. Face shadowed under a hood, but eyes caught the beam, hollow, fixed on me. It didn't approach fast, just stood there, breath visible in ragged clouds. Muttering low, "The craving consumes." The words slithered out, hoarse and broken, like a throat unused to speaking. My stomach nodded. Hiker? Lost in the storm? Delirious from hypothermia? These would claim people every year. Folks vanishing on trails. Search parties finding nothing but echoes. Or ferals. The whispers go. Outcasts living wild. Descendants of moonshiners or miners. Turned savage by the isolation. Back toward the cab slow. Tools clutched like weapons. The figure shifted, arms dangling limp, muttering again. Consumes craving. More rustles joined. Multiple footsteps now, circling the verge, breaths fogging from the brush. Shapes flickered peripheral, gaunt like the first, hunched and ragged, their presence a weight on the air. Stench hit faint, unwashed, with an undercurrent of decay, like bodies too long without food. Panic built slow, a creep in my veins. I didn't run, but my steps quickened, door yanking open. Slammed it shut, locked, engine cranking. Thank God it turned over without sputter. The figure watched, persistent gaze boring through the glass as dusk encroached, shadows lengthening. Revved out, tires slipping on ice before catching, mirrors showing the figure fading into white, but rustles pursued briefly, footsteps crunching parallel before falling behind. Drove the rest of the way shaking, heater blasting, but chill lingering. Made the depot, unloaded numb, told the foreman a vague story. Engine trouble, saw a drifter. He nodded, said Shenandoah's full of strays, folks the winter chews up. Drove home to Linda's arms, boys excited hugs, but sleep evaded, nightmares replaying the frosted warnings, the muttering gaze. That was 3 winters ago. I avoid those trails now. Stick to plowed roads, even if it adds miles. Linda notices the change, jumpy at night, staring into snowfalls like they're hiding something. The boys ask why I don't tell stories anymore. Truth is, the dread's embedded, a quiet sorrow for whatever haunts those verges, feral starve mad, or my mind cracking from isolation. The confusion gnaws, warnings echoing in dreams. What if the craving waits for my next slip, consuming subtle on the frost? Every run, I scan the edges, listening for rustles that promise the perils never truly faded. Story 19. I've been driving big rigs across the Appalachians for 27 years now, long enough that the curves and climbs feel like extensions of my own body. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, but they reward patience, slow and steady through the fog, respectful of the ice, mindful of the drop-offs that plunge into nothing. My name's Garrett, and back in Altoona, I've got a little house with my wife, Ruth, who's been holding down the fort since her daughter left for college out west. Ruth still packs me sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, writes little notes on the napkins. Drive safe, love you. I read them at stops, fold them careful, keep them in the glove box like talismans. The job's taken its toll, back pain, sleepless nights, the constant hum of diesel in my ears, but it's honest work, and it lets me provide. Most days, the solitude is a comfort. Most days. That evening in late September, the light was fading fast as I wound through the Alleghenies on a narrow forest trail I'd taken dozens of times before. I was hauling steel beams from a mill in Johnstown down to a construction site in Roanoke. Nothing perishable, so no real rush, but I wanted to get past the twisty parts before full dark. The main highway was under repair, cones and detours stretching for miles, so I cut over to the old trail that parallels the ridge. It's unpaved in sections, gravel crunching under the tires, flanked by dense hardwood that turns the path into a tunnel once the sun dips. The air smelled of coming rain, that heavy, metallic scent that settles in the hollows. I found a wide pullout where the trail flattened, a spot I'd used before, ringed by boulders and a stand of birches whose leaves were just starting to yellow. Perfect place to stretch my legs, eat the ham sandwich Ruth had packed, maybe close my eyes for 10 minutes before pushing on. I shut the engine down, the sudden quiet rushing in like water, filling a void. Crickets were already starting their evening chorus, and somewhere far off a barred owl called once, low and mournful. I climbed out, boots hitting the gravel, and leaned against the warm hood while I unwrapped the sandwich. The sun was a thin orange line behind the western ridge, casting long shadows that stretched across the pullout like fingers reaching for the last light. Took a bite, savored the mustard Ruth always spreads just right, and let my eyes wander. That's when I noticed the rocks, flat granite slabs half buried at the edge of the clearing, their surfaces etched with markings. At first I thought it was natural weathering, but as I stepped closer, chewing slower, I saw they were deliberate. Crude carvings of elongated jaws, teeth exaggerated and sharp, repeated in rows like warnings. Some looked old, moss creeping into the grooves, but others were fresh, edges clean, as if scratched recent. I'd seen similar symbols before in books or online, old Algonquian motifs tied to stories of famine and desperation, things I'd always dismissed as folklore meant to scare outsiders away from hunting grounds. Shook my head, finished the sandwich, balled up the wax paper. Just carvings, nothing more. Sat back in the cab with the door open, feet on the running board, sipping coffee from the thermos. The light bled out quick, dusk settling soft and purple. Crickets kept up their rhythm, but underneath it, something else started. Indistinct at first, like wind moving through the leaves but shaped different. Whispers, faint, overlapping, coming from the treeline, maybe 30 yards away. I tilted my head, listening, figuring it for echoes off the ridge or maybe teenagers camping nearby, playing some prank. But the words sharp and gradual, threading through the cricket song. Join feast. My skin prickled. I closed the door, rolled up the window, but the whispers persisted, clearer now, as if the glass wasn't there. Join the feast or starve forever. Not loud. More like breath carried on the cooling air, intimate, meant just for me. Heart picked up a notch, but I told myself it was fatigue, 12 hours on the road, mind playing tricks. Started the engine, let it idle, the familiar rumble a comfort. That's when the air changed, thickened, like breathing through wet wool. The temperature dropped sudden, though the gauge still read mild. I scanned the treeline, headlights off to save battery, relying on the fading dusk. Shadows moved, or seemed to, figures slinking from the deeper woods, thin and desperate, their outlines barely there against the trunks. Not animals, upright, but hunched, movements slow and deliberate, like every step cost something precious. One stepped into the pullout's edge, maybe 15 yards away, and the dying light caught its form. Emaciated, clothes hanging loose on a frame where ribs showed clear, skin pale and drawn tight. Arms too long, dangling, fingers twitching as if grasping for something just out of reach. Its head turned toward the truck, face shadowed, but eyes reflecting faint, fixed on me with an intensity that rooted me to the seat. More emerged behind it. 3, 4 gaunt silhouettes weaving between birches, their steps silent on the leaves. No aggression, just watching, waiting, evoking a need so deep it felt contagious. The whispers swelled, no longer distant, starve, forever, join. Coming from them, or through them, mouths moving in unison though no sound should carry that far. A stench reached me then, faint through the vents, sour, like bodies too long without food, sweat and waste and desperation baked in. My stomach turned, sandwich threatening to come back up. Were these people, squatters driven out by poverty, living wild in the national forest? I'd heard rumors, families off the grid, avoiding taxes and society, scavenging what they could. Or worse, addicts lost to the hills, bodies wasting while minds clung to survival. Rational thoughts, but the dread crept slow, a certainty that whatever they were, they weren't right. One raised a hand, palm out, invitation or plea, and took a step closer, joints creaking audible in the quiet. The carvings flashed in my mind, those elongated jaws now making terrible sense. I didn't think, just acted. Threw the rig into gear, tires spinning gravel as I peeled out, headlights snapping on to blaze the path ahead. Glanced in the mirrors, figures standing at the pullout's edge, unmoving, watching as I fled. The whispers followed for the first mile, threading through the engine noise. Feast, join, starve, then faded gradual, swallowed by distance and the rush of wind. Didn't stop till I hit pavement 20 minutes later, pulling into a lit Exxon where truckers gathered under fluorescent glow. Sat there with the engine running, hands clenched on the wheel till knuckles ached, staring at nothing while a couple drivers eyed me concerned. Told them I nodded off. Bad dream. Nothing more. But the cravings echoed inside me the rest of the drive, a hollow ache behind the ribs, as if the trail itself had planted something. That was 5 years ago come fall. I still haul steel, still take back roads when needed, but never that trail at dusk. Ruth says I've gone quieter, that I stare too long at sunsets now. Our daughter calls less since she had her own kids, and I wonder if the distance is partly mine. Some nights, when twilight paints the ridges purple and the crickets start, I hear whispers in the wind through the open window. Faint, indistinct, but there. Join, starve. I close it quick, turn on the TV loud, but the quiet dread remains, grounded in the memory of those thin figures and their unending need. Were they real? Feral folk driven mad by hunger, carvings their warning to outsiders? Or did isolation and fatigue birth ghosts from old stories? I don't know, and the not knowing is its own kind of starvation, a sorrow that settles deeper each twilight, whispering that somewhere in the Alleghenies, the feast still waits. Story 20. I've lived in these Appalachian hills my whole life, born and raised in a little holler outside of Asheville, where the Blue Ridge meets the sky. For the past 17 years, I've made my living as a delivery driver, hauling goods through the winding roads of the Pisgah National Forest to folks who don't much care for the outside world. It's solitary work, the kind that suits a man who's lost more than he cares to remember. My wife, Sarah, passed 5 years back from lung cancer that snuck up on us like fog in the valleys. She was the light in these dark woods, always humming old hymns while we drive these routes together. Now it's just me, the rumble of my old Chevy pickup, and the ghosts of conversations we never finished. That truck's seen better days, faded blue paint chipped from branches, tires worn from gravel, but it gets me where I need to go. On that particular afternoon in late October, with the leaves turning to fire and the air carrying the promise of frost, I was headed up to deliver propane and staples to Old Man Harlan and his kin, tucked away in a cabin near the craggy gardens overlook. It was a run I'd done 100 times, nothing special, so I thought. The drive started out peaceful enough. The sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, dappling the road ahead. I had a thermos of black coffee wedged between the seats, steaming up the cab with that bitter aroma that kept me alert. The radio crackled with some AM station out of Hendersonville, playing bluegrass tunes that echoed the rhythm of the tires on pavement. As I climbed higher, the road narrowed, asphalt giving way to dirt packed hard from years of use. Deer grazed off to the side, unbothered by my approach, and a hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp against the rustle of wind through the oaks. Sarah used to love spotting wildlife like that. She'd make me pull over just to watch. God's own artwork, she'd say, her eyes lighting up. I smiled at the memory, but it faded quick as the forest thickened. These mountains have a way of reminding you how small you are, how easily the wild can swallow a manhole. About an hour in, the scenery shifted subtly. The trees grew denser, their trunks gnarled like arthritic fingers reaching from the earth. This was the edge of what locals called the Silent Grove, a forgotten pocket of the Pisgah where trails petered out and cell signals died. I'd heard whispers about it in the diners along Route 276. Hunters who'd gotten disoriented, emerging rattled and silent. Hikers claiming the air felt wrong, heavy with unspoken warnings. Folks chalked it up to old Cherokee curses or Civil War echoes, but I figured it was just the isolation playing tricks. People out here spun yarns to pass the time, legends of feral families hiding in the brush, descendants of moonshiners who'd gone savage after the ravine-ewers chased them deep, or tales of the Wendigo, that starving spirit from northern lore that somehow migrated south, luring the desperate with promises of food only to consume them instead. Sarah had a fascination with those stories. She'd read them aloud by the fire, her voice dropping low for effect. "It's the hunger that gets you," she'd say. "Not the beast, but the emptiness inside." I laugh it off, but deep down, those tales stuck like burrs. As I rounded a bend, the sounds of the forest began to ebb. The wind died first, leaves hanging limp on branches that should have been swaying. Then the birds, mid-song, they just stopped like a record scratching to a halt. Even the truck's engine seemed muted, the usual growl reduced to a distant hum. I rolled down the window, expecting a rush of cool air, but it was still, stagnant, carrying only the faint scent of rotting leaves. My ears rang in the void, that high-pitched whine you get in too much quiet. I shook my head, blaming it on the altitude or maybe the coffee wearing off. But the unease settled in my gut, a cold knot that tightened with every mile. The road ahead looked the same, but felt different, oppressive, like the grove was watching, waiting for me to notice. Then came the tinkling. It started soft, almost whimsical, like wind chimes on a porch during a summer breeze. But there was no breeze. I slowed the truck, squinting through the dust-streaked windshield. Up ahead, suspended from the overhanging branches of a massive hickory, were these odd contraptions, strings of white fragments dangling like forgotten laundry. They clacked gently against each other, producing that hollow, rhythmic sound. I pulled to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and cut the engine. The silence rushed and then, absolute and unnerving, broken only by those chimes. Stepping out, my boots sank slightly into the soft earth, and I approached cautiously, the air thick enough to taste. Up close, they weren't chimes at all, they were bones. Bleached and brittle, small ones from rabbits or possums, tied with frayed cord that looked hand-twisted from vines or hide. There were clusters of them, maybe 20 in all, spaced along the branch like sentinels marking a boundary. I reached up, fingers brushing one of the larger pieces, a curved rib bone, smooth from exposure. Etched into it, in crude letters that looked scraped with a knife, were the words, "Wendigo's plea, depart." My breath caught. The legend flooded back, Sarah reciting how the Wendigo was born from cannibalism in starving winters, a curse that turned men into monsters, forever hungering. But this was no myth. Someone had made these, hung them here as a warning or a joke. I examined another. "Leave the hunger behind." The clacking grew louder in my mind, though the air remained still. Who would do this? Locals warding off trespassers? Some hermit artist lost to the woods? Or worse, those feral people the stories warned about, marking their territory with the remains of their kills. I felt eyes on me then, a prickle between my shoulder blades, but turning revealed only empty forest, shadows pooling under the trees as the sun dipped lower. Dismissing it as hillbilly superstition, I climbed back into the cab, the door slamming louder than it should in the hush. The engine turned over with a cough, and I eased forward, the chimes fading behind like a forgotten melody. But the silence didn't lift. If anything, it deepened, wrapping around the truck like fog. The road twisted on, narrower now, forcing me to navigate ruts and roots that jutted like veins. Minutes stretched, the dashboard clock ticking slower than it ought. I tried humming one of Sarah's hymns to fill the void, but my voice came out thin, swallowed by the grove. Memories surfaced unbidden. Grandpa telling tales around the potbelly stove, his face weathered as bark. Some places in these mountains ain't meant for the living, he'd rasp. They feed on your fears, turn 'em real. I'd nod, wide-eyed as a boy, but now those words gnawed at me. The light grew dimmer, the canopy blocking what remained of the day, turning the woods into a twilight maze. A low moan pierced the quiet then, rolling from the depths of the forest like a stomach's growl amplified 100-fold. It was guttural, pained, a sound of eternal starvation, echoing off the trunks. I gripped the wheel, knuckles whitening, and listened. It came again, closer, rising and falling like a plea. Not an animal, too human, too desperate. Maybe a hiker in trouble, injured and calling out, or wind through caves. But the air was dead calm. I slowed, scanning the trees, but saw only stillness. The moan layered over itself, becoming a chorus, whispers threading through, hungry, always hungry. My mind raced to rationalize. Echoes from a distant valley, perhaps, or my imagination filling the silence. But the cold sweat on my back said otherwise. Sarah's voice echoed in my head, the emptiness inside. Was this what she meant? The cancer had hollowed her out, left her moaning in the night, and now the grove seemed to mimic that agony. The shapes appeared next, fleeting at first, a shadow darting between pines, tall and emaciated, moving with a lurch that wasn't quite right. I blinked, telling myself it was a deer or a trick of the light. But another flickered to the left, skeletal frame pale against the bark, limbs elongated from malnutrition. Feral people. It had to be. I'd seen documentaries, read about clans in these hills who shunned society, surviving on what they could scavenge, their bodies wasted by hardship. They avoided contact, but hunger could drive them bold. The moans swelled, surrounding the truck, vibrating through the metal. A shape lunged closer, brushing the undergrowth, hollow eyes reflecting my headlights as I flicked them on early, mouth open in a silent scream. Panic bloomed, slow and insidious, my heart pounding like a drum in the quiet. I accelerated, the truck bouncing wildly, but the shapes kept pace, weaving through the trees like ghosts. One got near enough that I saw details, skin stretched tight over ribs, hair matted and wild, fingers clawing at the air. They weren't attacking, just warning, pleading. The chimes reappeared ahead, more of them now, dangling from every low branch, their clacks joining the moans in a symphony of dread. Inscriptions flashed in the beams, feed the void, join us. The road seemed endless, the grove a labyrinth designed to trap. Branches scraped the roof, sounding like nails, and something thumped the bumper, a root I prayed. Memories assaulted me, Sarah's final days, her wasted form, whispering of shadows that hungered. Grandpa's warnings, my own isolation, a man adrift in these hills. Finally, the trees parted, and I burst on an open road, sounds rushing back, wind, distant traffic life. I didn't stop until Harlan's cabin, unloading with shaking hands. He asked if I'd had a rough patch. I mumbled about deer. That night, home on my empty bed, the grove's cling remained. I hear the moans in every creek, see shapes in the shadows. I've rerouted my drives, but the fear persists, a sorrowful confusion. Was it real? those starving souls born from the mountain's neglect? Or my mind, cracked by loss? The silence waits, and some hungers never fade. They linger, patient, in the unknown corners of the heart. Story 21. I've been hauling freight through these Appalachian backcountry roads for close to 20 years now, ever since I left the mill job that was grinding my bones to dust. It's a lonesome gig, driving a big rig loaded with timber or supplies from one forgotten holler to the next. But it suits me. Gives me time to chew on my thoughts without anyone prying. My name's Harlan. Folks call me Har for short. And after losing my boy to that damn opioid mess sweeping these hills like wildfire, the solitude feels like a mercy. He was just 19, thought he could handle the pain pills after a logging accident, but they handled him instead. My wife, Ellie, couldn't take the grief. She packed up and headed to her sister's in Charlotte 2 years back, leaving me with the echo of an empty house and the hum of diesel engines. These mountains, though, they've always been my constant. The Appalachian National Forest, with its twisting trails and deep gorges, is like an old friend who doesn't talk much but knows all your secrets. Or so I thought until that night last fall, when the shadows on that shadowed path showed me a side of the wild I wish I'd never seen. The day had started routine enough. I dropped off a load of plywood at a sawmill near Robbinsville, the kind of place where the air smells like fresh-cut pine and the workers wave you off with calloused hands. Running empty on the return, my rig felt lighter, bouncing a bit more over the ruts as I headed east toward the main highway. The sun was dipping low, painting the ridges in hues of orange and purple, and I figured I'd make it home before full dark. But traffic on 74 had snarled up with some tourist fender bender, leaf peepers gawking at the fall colors, so I took the old cut-off trail through the Nantahala. It's not much more than a logging road, narrow and overgrown, but I'd used it plenty before to shave off miles. The forest closed in quick, hemlocks and rhododendrons forming walls on either side, the canopy blotting out the fading light. My headlights flicked on automatically, cutting beams through the gathering dusk, illuminating flecks of dust and the occasional moth fluttering in the glow. As the path narrowed, forcing me to ease off the gas, a quiet settled in that wasn't just the absence of noise. It was heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. The radio, which had been crackling with some staticky country station, went dead silent, not even static filling the speakers. I twisted the dial, but nothing came through. Figured it was the mountains blocking the signal. Happens all the time in these deep cuts. But my cab felt smaller somehow, the dashboard lights casting eerie shadows on my hands. I cracked the window for fresh air, and the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves wafted in, mixed with something sharper, almost metallic, like blood from a fresh kill. Memories of my boy crept in then. How we'd hike these trails when he was little, him pointing out deer tracks, his laughter echoing off the rocks. "Dad, what's out there in the dark?" He'd ask, and I'd say, "Just the woods, son. Nothing to fear but getting lost." But lost is what he got, in more ways than one. I shook the thought, focusing on the road, but the unease lingered, a low hum in my chest. Night fell proper as I delved deeper, the path twisting like a snake through the understory. That's when I first noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe a deer or a bobcat catching the headlights. A pair of glowing orbs low to the ground, fixed on the truck from the brush about 20 yards ahead. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I slowed, honking the horn to scare whatever was off, but the eyes held steady, ravenous in their stillness. Then another pair appeared, higher up, maybe at chest height, piercing through the ferns. And another, off to the left, unblinking and hungry. My heart picked up, thumping against my ribs. Raccoons? Coyotes? But they didn't scatter like animals should. They watched, multiple pairs now, 4 or 5, tracking the rig as I inched forward. The beams caught glints of them, not the usual green tapetum of wildlife, but a dull yellow, like embers smoldering in ash. I told myself it was nothing, just critters curious about the intrusion. But the gaze felt personal, devouring, like they were sizing me up not for threat, but for sustenance. The path grew rougher, branches scraping the sides of the cab with a screech that set my teeth on edge. Up close, I saw gouges in the bark, fresh ones, deep and ragged, as if something had clawed at the trees in a frenzy. Not bear marks. Those are deliberate, territorial. These looked desperate, erratic, like whatever made them was tearing at the wood in hunger or rage. I gripped the wheel tighter, my palms slick, and accelerated a touch, the engine growling in protest. The eyes kept pace, darting from shadow to shadow, always reappearing just ahead or alongside. A chill seeped into the cab, despite the heater blasting, and I rolled up the window. Locking the doors like that would help against whatever lurked out there. Whispers started then, faint at first, filtering through the vents or maybe just in my head. A voice, raspy and hollow, like wind through dry bones. Heed the Wendigo's hunger. The word sent a jolt through me. Wendigo, that old legend from the native tales, whispered around campfires in these parts. A spirit of insatiable appetite, born from starvation in the winter wilds, driving folks to madness and worse. Ellie used to scare our boy with watered-down versions, saying it was why you never ate alone in the woods. It calls to the empty inside you, she'd say, her eyes twinkling but serious underneath. I'd scoff, call it superstition, but now, with those eyes boring into me, it didn't feel so far-fetched. Was it feral people out there? I'd heard the stories. Families gone wild after the Depression, or runaways from the law, living off the land until humanity sloughed off like dead skin. They'd be gaunt, desperate, their gazes ravenous from constant want. Or maybe it was my mind cracking, the isolation and grief conjuring phantoms from the dark. The voice came again, clearer, overlapping with itself like multiple throats murmuring in unison. Heed. The hunger. Branches thrashed suddenly, not from wind but from movement, shapes shifting in the periphery, tall and hunched, slipping through the undergrowth. I caught glimpses, pale limbs, matted hair, figures too thin to be healthy, moving with a predatory grace. The eyes multiplied, dozens now, flanking the trail, their stare intensifying the quiet fear that had been building. My breath came shallow, fogging the glass, and I floored the accelerator, the rig lurching over roots and rocks. Something banged against the trailer. A branch? A hand? And the gouges appeared on more trees, fresh splinters flying as if carved in real time. The whispers swelled, filling the cab despite the sealed windows, a chorus of hunger. Heed it. Panic clawed up my throat, memories flooding. My boy's hollow eyes in his last days, the way he'd beg for just one more pill, the emptiness devouring him from within. Was this the same? The mountains reflecting my sorrow back at me. Or something real, something ancient and starved lurking in the Nanahala shadows? I swerved around a fallen log, the eyes closing in, their gaze like weights pulling me down. Finally, the path widened, spilling onto paved road, the whispers fading as streetlights pierced the night. I didn't stop until a truck stopped miles away, hands shaking as I nursed a coffee, staring into the black. That trail shadow lingers, a peripheral blur that makes me jump at nothing. I avoid the cutoff now, sticking to highways, but the gaze follows in dreams, ravenous and unblinking. Was it feral survivors, driven mad by isolation? Or my own demons, given form by the wild? The fear sits heavy, a confusion laced with sorrow, whispering that some hungers can't be sated. They just wait, patient in the dark, for the next empty soul to wander by. Story 22. I've been trucking these winding Appalachian roads for over 2 decades now, ever since I got out of the Army and needed something to keep my hands busy and my mind from wandering too far into the past. My name's Earl, and I haul everything from lumber to groceries for the folks scattered through these hills like forgotten seeds. It's a life of long hauls and longer silences, which suits me fine after what happened with my daughter. She was only 12 when that fever took her back in '98, some rare bug from the creek water, the doctor said. My wife, Clara, blamed the isolation, said the mountains swallowed our girl whole. She left not long after, heading to the flatlands of Georgia, leaving me with the echoes in our old cabin and the rumble of my Kenworth to drown them out. These forests, though, the Chattahoochee National Forest in particular, have always felt like kin, dense with white pines and hemlocks, riddled with trails that snake through like veins. They hold you close, whisper secrets if you listen. But on that crisp autumn evening last year, those whispers turned to something darker, a need that clings to me still, fading but never gone. The run was nothing out of the ordinary, picking up a load of hardwoods from a mill near Helen and dropping them off at a warehouse in Clayton. I'd taken the back route through the Chattahoochee countless times, preferring the quiet over the interstate's roar. The sun was hanging low, casting that golden haze over the ridges, turning the leaves to shades of rust and amber. My cab smelled of stale coffee and pine air freshener. The radio tuned low to some AM station preaching sermons that faded in and out with the terrain. I sipped from my thermos, thinking about Clara's last letter, postmarked from Atlanta, full of regrets, but no invitations home. "The hills take more than they give," she'd written. I crumpled in my glove box months ago, but the words stuck. As the road climbed uphill, my rig groaning under the empty trailer's weight on the return leg, the forest seemed to thicken, the underbrush crowding the shoulders like it was reaching out. It started subtle, the way these things do in the mountains, a gradual hush falling over the woods. The bird song that had been my companion tapered off, replaced by the steady thrum of my tires on cracked asphalt. I didn't think much of it first. Fall evenings could turn quiet as animals bedded down. But as I crested a rise, the silence deepened, pressing in like fog rolling up from the river. No wind rustled the branches, no distant creek babbled. Even the engine's growl seemed muffled, as if the air was too thick to carry sound. I rolled down the window, expecting a chill breeze, but the air hung still, heavy with the scent of moist earth and something faintly sour, like spoiled meat left in the sun. My skin prickled, that old soldier's instinct kicking in, the feeling of being watched from cover. I scanned the tree line, but saw only shadows lengthening in the dying light. That's when the first sign appeared. Nailed to a weathered post at the roadside, half obscured by vines, was a faded board, its paint chipped and peeling. I slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. The words were scrawled in what looked like old charcoal or maybe blood long dried. "Wendigo awaits. Turn back." A chill ran down my spine. Wendigo. That was one of those forest legends Clara used to tell her girl at bedtime, stories passed down from her Cherokee grandma. A spirit born of hunger in the harsh winters, driving men to devour their own kin. But it was just folklore, meant to warn against greed or straying too far. Probably some locals' idea of a joke or a way to keep outsiders off private land. I chuckled to myself, though it came out forced, and eased the accelerator. The rig lumbered on, but the sign lingered in my rear view, a blot against the green. The road narrowed further, forcing me to gear down as it twisted through denser stands of trees. More signs cropped up, faded planks leaning against trunks, boards hammered crookedly to low branches. Insatiable need ahead, flee. The hunger claims all. They were weathered, some so old the words were barely legible, moss creeping over the letters like nature reclaiming its own. I counted half a dozen in a mile, each echoing that Wendigo theme, warnings of a need that never fades. My mind wandered to the feral people rumors that floated around truck stops. Folks who'd gone off-grid, families descended from moonshiners or Civil War deserters, living wild and wasting away in these remote pockets. They'd be desperate, scavenging, their eyes hollow from want. Was this their handiwork, marking territory to scare off intruders? I gripped the wheel tighter, the cab feeling smaller, and flipped on the headlights as dusk settled in earnest. The beams cut through the gloom, illuminating patches of fog that hadn't been there before. A pall descended then, slow and insidious, like ink bleeding into water. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It was a presence, wrapping around the truck, seeping through the vents. I tried the radio again, twisting the knob, but got only static, white noise that grated like whispers just out of reach. My thoughts turned inward, to nights in the cabin after Clara left, when the quiet pressed so hard I'd talk to myself just to hear a voice. "Ain't nothing but signs," I muttered, but the words fell flat in the cab. Up ahead, the road dipped into a hollow, the trees arching overhead like a cathedral gone wrong. That's when the shuffling started, faint at first, a rustle in the underbrush like feet dragging through leaves. Not an animal. Too deliberate, too human. I slowed, peering into the darkness beyond the headlights. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted, pacing the truck from the left, then the right. Starved sighs followed, low and ragged, like breath from lungs long empty. They echoed through the woods, rising and falling in a rhythm that mimicked hunger pangs, deep inhalations ending in whimpers of need. My heart quickened, a cold sweat breaking on my forehead. Rational thoughts fought through, maybe wind through hollow logs or echoes from a distant camp. But there was no wind, and the sighs carried a desperation, a plea that twisted my gut. I thought of my daughter in her last days, her shallow breaths in the dim cabin light, Clara whispering prayers as the fever burned her up. "She's hungry for air," the doc had said, but it was more than that, a need the mountains couldn't fill. The shuffling grew closer, branches snapping softly, as if whatever was out there was testing the edges of the road. Then the figures appeared, fleeting at first, a glimpse in the periphery, a shape darting behind a trunk. Tall and faded, like ghosts worn thin by time. They moved with an insistent lurch, always just out of the headlights, full glare. I caught details and flashes. Pale skin stretched over bones, hair matted and wild, clothes ragged remnants hanging loose. Feral people, had to be survivors of the wild, their forms embodying the signs' warnings. They didn't attack, didn't show themselves fully, but their presence pressed in, a chilling insistence that made my breath come short. One got bold, stepping into the beam's edge, eyes sunken and dark, mouth open in a silent sigh, hands outstretched like begging for scraps. The need in that gaze hit me like a wave, mirroring the emptiness I'd carried since losing my family. Panic built slow, a creep of dread that rooted in my chest. The sighs overlapped now, a chorus of insatiable want, filling the cab despite the closed windows. More figures flickered, 3, 4, shuffling parallel to the road, their movements synchronized, insistent. Branches bore fresh scratches where they passed, gouges like desperate claws seeking purchase. I accelerated, the rig protesting with a shudder, but the path wound tighter, forcing caution. Memories assaulted me. Clara's tear-streaked face as she packed, blaming the hills for our sorrow, my daughter's final whisper, "Daddy, I'm so hungry." Was this the mountain's curse, reflecting back the needs we buried? The figures closed in, one banging a fist, or was it a rock? Against the trailer, the thud echoing like a demand. I floored it through a straight stretch, tires spinning on loose gravel, branches whipping the mirrors. The signs blurred past, their faded words of final taunt. Gradually, the shuffling faded, the sighs trailing into silence as the road climbed out of the hollow. I burst onto the main highway, lights from distant farms piercing the night, sounds returning, crickets, a far-off train. I didn't stop until Clayton, unloading with hands that shook, muttering to the warehouse guy about a rough patch. He nodded, unknowing, but the echo remains, a grounded dread that haunts the quiet trails of my mind. I avoid that route now, sticking to interstates, but in the still nights at the cabin, I hear those starved sighs in the wind, see faded figures in the shadows beyond the porch light. Was it feral folk, driven by real hunger in these forgotten woods? Or my own insatiable need for what's lost, given form by isolation? The mountains keep their secrets, and some warnings fade but never truly depart. They linger, insistent, in the pall of unfulfilled sorrow. Story 23. I've spent most of my life behind the wheel of a big rig, hauling aggregates, gravel, sand, crushed stone, from quarries deep in the Appalachian Mountains to construction sites scattered across Georgia and Tennessee. It's backbreaking work in its own way, the constant vibration rattling your bones, the isolation wearing on your mind like water on rock. My name's Silas, and after my brother Jeb died in a logging accident 10 years back, I took to the road full-time. He was the one who loved these ridges, always talking about the peace up high where the world fell away. Our ma raised us in a drafty cabin near Dahlonega, teaching us the old ways. Respect the land, heed the signs, don't tempt the hunger of the hills. Jeb laughed it off, but I saw how the mountains claimed him, a slide of earth burying him alive. My wife, Lena, couldn't stand the grief. She moved to Knoxville with our kids, saying the solitude was poisoning me. Maybe she was right. These days, it's just me, the truck's growl, and the endless switchbacks that carve through the Chattahoochee like scars. But that evening last fall, on a high ridge path I'd driven 100 times, the solitude turned sour, pierced by cries that hollowed me out from inside. The day had dragged on longer than expected. I'd loaded up at the quarry near Suches, the air thick with dust that clung to my flannel like a second skin. The sun was dipping toward the horizon as I started the climb, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow road like fingers grasping at the tires. This ridge path was an old logging trail, widened just enough for semis but still treacherous, steep drops on one side, sheer rock faces on the other. Folks avoided it after dark, whispering about wrecks and worse, but I knew every curve, every pothole. The cab smelled of diesel and the ham sandwich I'd half-eaten at lunch. The radio tuned to a fuzzy station out of Blairsville playing gospel hymns that cut in and out with the elevation. I sipped lukewarm coffee from my thermos, thinking about Jeb, how we'd hike these paths as kids, him daring me to peer over the edges into the misty voids below. Ain't nothing down there but echoes, he'd say. But echoes can fool you, make you believe in things that ain't there. As I ascended, the forest changed. The trees thinned out up high, replaced by scrubby pines and boulders worn smooth by wind. The air grew cooler, sharper, carrying the faint tang of ozone like a storm brewing far off. Solitude wrapped around me like a blanket, the kind that smothers more than warms. No other vehicles passed. This route was for locals who knew better than to linger. The engine labored, groaning against the grade, and I downshifted, feeling the trailer's weight pull like an anchor. That's when the sounds of the world began to fade. The wind, which had been whistling through the cracks, died abrupt. The birds, hawks and crows that wheeled overhead, went silent. Even the radio sputtered to static, then nothing. I twisted the dial, but got only a hollow hum, like the station had vanished in a thin air. Unease settled in my gut, slow and cold, but I chalked it up to the altitude playing tricks on the signals. The ridge leveled out somewhat, the path hugging the spine of the mountain with drop-offs on both sides now. Twilight crept in, turning the sky to bruised purples and the rocks to ghostly grays. I flipped on the headlights, their beams slicing through the gathering fog that rolled up from the valleys. That's when the first cry echoed, hollow like wind through a rotted log, but with a depth that vibrated in my chest. It started low, a moan that rose to a wail, then faded into the mist. I eased off the gas, straining to listen. An animal? A coyote or bobcat in distress? But it didn't sound right. Too empty, too human in its despair. The cry came again, clearer this time, from somewhere along the ridge ahead. Words formed in the echo, or maybe my mind shaped them. Sate the Wendigo or perish. A shiver ran through me. Wendigo, that was Ma's old tale, a legend from the natives that seeped into our folklore. A hunger spirit, born from starvation in the long winters, whispering to the desperate until they turned on their own. Jeb used to tease me with it around the campfire, mimicking hollow cries to make me jump. But this wasn't a joke. It felt real, grounded in the chill air. I shook my head, muttering curses under my breath. Just the wind, Silas. Get on with it. But the cries persisted, intermittent at first, piercing the solitude like needles. Along the roadside, I started noticing the logs, hollowed-out trunks, weathered and split, propped against boulders or lying half-buried in the dirt. They weren't natural. Someone had carved them, scooping out the innards until they were mere shells. As my headlights swept over one, I saw runes etched into the bark, crude symbols of famine, stick figures with bloated bellies and skeletal limbs, arrows pointing to empty mouths. Warnings, maybe, or markers from some long-forgotten ritual. Feral people came to mind then. The stories truckers swapped at diners about clans hiding in these heights, descendants of miners or hermits who'd gone wild, surviving on scraps and a land's meager offerings. They'd be hollowed by hunger, their cries a call for sustenance. Or perhaps it was hikers lost to exposure, their echoes lingering like ghosts. I gripped the wheel tighter, the truck's cab feeling exposed despite the steel around me. The path wound on, the cries growing in frequency, overlapping like a chorus from the voids below. They seemed to come from all directions now, below the ridge, among the rocks, even from the empty passenger seat where Jeb used to ride shotgun on long hauls. Sate, perish, the words wormed into my thoughts, stirring memories of Ma's warnings. The mountains got appetites, boys. Don't feed him your weakness. Jeb's accident flashed before me. The way the earth had opened up, swallowing him in a roar of dirt and roots, his cries cut short. Was this the ridge's way of remembering? The fog thickened, reducing visibility to a few yards, and I slowed to a crawl, the trailer swaying precariously. Shadows stirred in the mist. Hollow forms, elongated and vague, approaching from the tree-line. Not clear enough to be people, but not tricks of light either. One loomed closer, a silhouette with sunken features, arms outstretched like begging. My heart pounded, breath fogging the glass as I leaned forward. Panic built gradual, a rising tide that drowned reason. The cries swelled, filling the cab, vibrating through the seats. I imagined feral eyes watching from the hollow logs, runes pulsing with some unexplainable dread. Survival kicked in. I had to get off this ridge. I accelerated blindly, the engine roaring as I navigated the turns by memory. Branches, or hands, scraped the sides, and a shadow darted across the path, forcing me to swerve. The truck teetered on the edge, gravel crumbling into the abyss, but I corrected, descending hastily into the lower slopes. The cries faded behind, the fog lifting as I dropped elevation, normal sounds returning, wind, distant owls, the radio crackling back to life. I didn't stop until the quarry town, pulling into a lot with hands still shaking. Folks at the bar asked if I'd seen a ghost. I laughed it off, blaming fatigue. But the ridge's mystery endures, a realistic horror that haunts the heights of my mind. In quiet moments at the cabin, I hear those hollow cries in the wind, see shadows along the paths I drive. Was it feral survivors, driven mad by the mountain's famine? Or my own hollowed grief, echoing back? The solitude offers no answers, just a lingering sorrow, a confusion that perishes nothing but peace. The Appalachians keep their voids, and some cries never truly fade. They call from the ridges, waiting for the next soul to listen. Story 24. I've been delivering propane and heating oil to the remote cabins scattered through these Appalachian hills for over 2 decades now, ever since I hung up my tools from the coal mines that chewed up my daddy and his daddy before him. It's a living that keeps me moving, keeps the demons at bay, the kind that come from watching good men waste away in the dark, or from the bottle that nearly claimed me after my Marla passed from that lingering cough the doctors couldn't fix. She was the heart of our little home on the edge of the forest, always with a warm meal and a story from her Cherokee kin about the spirits in the woods. They whisper when you're alone, she'd say, her eyes distant like she'd heard them herself. Now it's just me, Roy Tanner, rattling along in my battered Ford with tanks strapped in the bed, navigating trails that ain't on no map. The Chattahoochee National Forest is my backyard, with its towering pines and tangled underbrush that could swallow a man whole if he ain't careful. Folks out here live off-grid for a reason, some running from the law, others from their own shadows. I've heard the tales around flickering campfires, feral people lurking in the thickets, descendants of old settlers who went wild after the hard times, their eyes hollow from hunger that never quits. Legends of the ravenous one, too, a presence born from starvation winters, murmuring warnings to those who intrude. I always nodded polite, but deep down I figured it was the isolation talking, the mind filling voids with dread. Until that humid afternoon in early fall, when a choked stretch of thicket turned those whispers into something I can't shake loose. The day started ordinary enough, with the sun beating down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the cab into a sweatbox despite the AC wheezing its last. I just topped off the tanks at the depot in Helen, the air thick with the metallic tang of fuel and the chatter of locals swapping gossip over coffee. My route took me up toward Woody Gap, delivering to a cluster of cabins where folks braced for the coming chill. Old Man Harlan was first on the list, a hermit type who'd lost his family to the bottle years back, living in a sagging shack buried in the woods. His trail was rough, but I knew it well. A dirt path that wound through open meadows at first, wildflowers nodding in the breeze, before diving into the denser parts where the forest reclaimed everything. Birds sang their lazy tunes, and a distant stream gurgled like laughter. I had the window cracked, letting in the scent of pine and wild honeysuckle, my mind wandering to Marla's stories. She'd weave them slow, about how the land remembered famines, how it hungered quiet-like for repayment. "Listen for the murmurs, Roy," she'd warn. "They're the ravenous one calling." I'd kiss her forehead, call it nonsense, but her voice stuck with me like sap on bark. As I turned on a Harlan spur, the landscape shifted. The meadows gave way to a wall of green, the thicket. Locals called it the choke, a snarled maze of vines, briars, and laurel that strangled the trail, forcing vehicles to a crawl or stopping them altogether. It stretched for maybe a mile, but felt eternal, the kind of place where sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, casting everything in mottled shadows. My truck bounced over roots that humped the path like buried bones, branches scraping the sides with a sound like nails on tin. The air grew heavier here, humid and still, carrying a faint rot like something dead hidden in the leaves. I slowed, navigating careful, the engine's rumble the only noise breaking the hush. No birds now, no rustle of small game, just the oppressive quiet that presses on your ears until they ring. I'd driven through before without issue, but that day, unease settled in my gut, slow and cold, like swallowing creek water. The thicket seemed alive, vines draping over the hood, as if testing, tasting. About halfway in, where the path narrowed to barely wider than the truck, the murmurs emerged. Faint at first, like a breeze sighing through the foliage, but there was no breeze. I killed the engine to listen, thinking maybe a radio static or an animal call echoing strange. The cab went silent, and there they were, low, ravenous tones rising from the underbrush, weaving through the vines like threads. "The ravenous one warns," they seemed to say, the words forming in my mind more than my ears, hungry and insistent. My skin prickled, hair standing on end, whined through hollow stems. A trick of the mind in the quiet, but the air hung dead, not a leaf stirring. I stepped out, boots crunching on dried twigs that snapped loud in the stillness. The murmurs persisted, surrounding me, as if voices hid just beyond sight. Feral folk, perhaps. I'd seen glimpses over the years, shadowy figures darting away, their lives a scramble for survival in these forgotten pockets. Starved by the wild, they might murmur to ward off outsiders, protecting their meager claims. I grabbed a tank from a bed, figuring the path ahead was too choked for the truck, and I'd hike the rest to Harlan's. The vines tugged at my sleeves as I waded in, thorns nicking my skin like tiny demands. The thicket closed around me, branches interlacing overhead to form a tunnel dim as dusk. Sweat trickled down my back, mixing with the humid air that clung like a second skin. The murmurs grew clearer, layering over themselves, warns, ravenous. I pushed on, tank heavy on my shoulder, but the path twisted, vines coiling tighter. That's when I noticed the forms. At first, they seemed natural, loops of ivy and briar knotted by wind or animals. But as I paused, wiping sweat from my eyes, they suggested more. Hollow eyes shaped from curled leaves, mouths agape and twisted bark, limbs outstretched like beggars pleading. One vine cluster formed a gaunt figure, ribs etched in thorns, suggesting a ravenous entity frozen in the foliage. My breath caught, pareidolia, sure, the brain making monsters for mess. But these felt deliberate, insistent, as if the thicket was shaping itself to warn or lure. The grip tightened slow, vines snagging my boots, pulling with a subtle insistence that made my heart quicken. I yanked free, but thorns drew blood, warm and sticky on my hands. The murmurs intensified, filling the air like a chorus of empty stomachs, ravenous and unrelenting. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, fleeting shapes among the twists, pale and emaciated, eyes glinting hungry from the green. Feral people had to be, their bodies wasted by endless want, murmuring as they circled, waiting for weakness. One form loomed closer, a whisper of movement, a hand-like branch reaching. Panic bloomed gradual, a vice squeezing my chest. Memories surged. Marla's last days, her wasted frame murmuring in delirium about hungers in the dark. Micah's body found tangled in vines, his face peaceful but empty. Was this the land's revenge, its ravenous quiet claiming what it could? I dropped the tank, its thud muffled by the undergrowth, and clawed forward, vines whipping my face like lashes. The entities suggested themselves bolder, hollow cheeks in the roots, fingers grasping from the soil, embodying a dread that gnawed at my resolve. The murmurs swelled to a roar in my ears. The ravenous one Warren's feed. I burst through at last, stumbling into Harlan's clearing, gasping, bloodied. He met me with a shotgun leveled, eyes wide. "When God's name got you, Roy?" I mumbled about briars, fetched the tank quick from where I'd left it, oddly untangled now, and hiked back faster, the murmurs trailing faint like echoes. The truck fired up, and I backed out slow, branches parting reluctant. But the ravenous, quiet dread persists, rooting deep in the silence of my days. Nights alone in the cabin, I hear murmurs in the wind through the cracks, see twisted forms in the shadows beyond the lantern light. I skirt that thicket now, taking detours that add hours, but the hunger lingers, a confusion of grief and green, a sorrow that whispers unchecked. The Appalachians weave their warnings tight, and some entities never fully release their grip. They murmur on, ravenous for the pieces they take. Let's move to the last story. I've been hauling timber through these twisted Appalachian backroads for what feels like a lifetime, ever since the mill job dried up and left me with nothing but calluses and regrets. My name's Clyde, and I come from a long line of mountain men who scraped by on what the forest gave and took in equal measure. Growing up in a drafty cabin near the edge of the Nantahala, I learned early that these woods ain't just trees. They're alive with history, soaked in the blood and sweat of folks who came before. My pa used to tell stories by the wood stove, his voice rough from years of sawdust, about feral people hiding in hollows, descendants of Civil War deserters who'd gone savage, surviving on roots and the occasional lost hiker. Or legends of the Wendigo, that starving spirit from up north that wandered south with the winds, keeping silent vigil over the hungry and the alone. I'd listen wide-eyed as a boy, but time hardens a man. After losing my sister to a fever that swept the holler when we were kids, and then my own boy to a logging mishap that crushed him under a felled oak, I buried those tales deep. My wife, June, couldn't stand the grief. She left for the city lights of Asheville, saying the isolation was eating us alive. Now it's just me, the rumble of my old Mack truck loaded with fresh-cut logs, and the endless trails that wind through the forest like veins pulsing with secrets. But that final haul last autumn, on a trail I thought I knew like my own scars, showed me that some vigils never end. They watch, silent and unending, with an appetite that haunts you long after you fled. The day had dragged on under a leaden sky, the kind that presses down on the ridges like a warning of rain that never comes. I'd picked up the load at a clear-cut site near the Georgia line, the air thick with the sharp tang of pine sap and chainsaw exhaust. The crew waved me off with nods, their faces smeared with dirt, and I eased the rig onto the narrow Forest Service road that snaked back toward the mill. This trail, was an old one, seldom used except by loggers like me. Flanked by towering hemlocks and oaks, their branches interlacing overhead to form a canopy that filtered the light into dim, shifting patterns. I'd driven it dozens of times, the truck's tires crunching over gravel and fallen leaves, the engine's steady growl my only companion. The radio had fizzled out miles back, reception spotty in these deep cuts, so I rode in silence, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos and letting my mind wander to better days. June and I used to picnic up here before the boy came along, spreading a blanket under the trees, her laughter cutting through the quiet like birdsong. But laughter fades, and now the forest just echoed my solitude back at me. As the road climbed higher, winding along a ridge that overlooked misty valleys below, a subtle change crept in. The wind, which had been whispering through the leaves, died away abrupt-like, leaving the air still and heavy. No squirrels chattered from the branches. No deer flashed white tails in the underbrush. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain, waiting for a sound that never comes. I shifted in my seat, chalking it up to the weather turning, but a prickle started at the base of my neck. That old instinct from hunting trips with Pa, the feeling of being watched. I scanned the mirrors, seeing only the trailer swaying behind, loaded with logs that creaked softly like old bones settling. The trail narrowed here, forcing me to ease off the gas, the truck lumbering over ruts worn deep by years of rain. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped behind the peaks, turning the woods into a patchwork of grays and blacks. I flipped on the headlights, their beams cutting yellow swaths through the gloom, illuminating trunks that seemed to lean in closer, as if curious about the intruder in their midst. That's when the whispers began. Faint at first, like leaves rustling in a breeze that wasn't there. But as I rounded a bend, they grew distinct, soft, sibilant words weaving through the trees. I slowed the truck, rolling down the window, and strained to hear. Wendigo's vigil, beware. It seemed to say, the phrase repeating like a mantra from the bark itself. My heart stuttered. Pa's stories flooded back. The Wendigo, a presence that kept eternal watch over the starving, its appetite unending, silent as the grave. But this was no spirit, maybe wind through knotholes, or my mind playing tricks in the isolation. I shook my head, muttering curses, and pressed on. But the whispers persisted, emanating from the trees lining the path. Up close, I saw carvings, crude etchings in the bark, weathered but deliberate. Vigil of the unending, beware the appetite. They dotted the trunks like scars, some fresh with sap oozing like blood, others faded to whispers themselves. Who'd done this? Locals marking territory? Or those feral people the tales warned about, holding their own silent vigils in the shadows, their hunger driving them to madness? The truck groaned forward, but the sense of being watched intensified, a palpable weight pressing against the cab. I glanced to the sides, catching flickers in the periphery, silent forms standing vigil among the trees, still as statues, their outlines blurred in the fading light. Tall and gaunt, they didn't move, didn't call out, just watched with an intensity that made my mouth go dry. Feral folk had to be wasted by the wild, their bodies hollowed by an appetite that the forest couldn't sate. I'd heard the rumors at the mill, sightings of shadowy figures near clear cuts, eyes reflecting firelight, never approaching but always there, waiting. Pa said they were the mountains forgotten, survivors who'd turned inward, their humanity stripped away layer by layer. One form shifted slightly, a branch snapping underfoot, and I swore I saw eyes, dark, unblinking, radiating a hunger that wasn't just for food. It was deeper, unending, like the void that had opened in me after losing my boy, a vigil of grief that watched every waking moment. Panic started slow, a creep of ice in my veins. The whispers swelled, overlapping from all directions, the trees themselves seeming to hold vigil, their branches like arms raised in silent plea or threat. Beware, vigil, appetite. The forms multiplied, 5, 6, standing sentinel along the trail, their presence a chilling realism that rooted me in place. I accelerated, the engine roaring, but the path twisted sharp, forcing caution. A log, or was it a limb, jutted into the road, and I swerved, the trailer fishtailing on loose gravel. Something thumped the side, a hand maybe cold and desperate. Memories assaulted me. My sister's wasted form in the cabin bed, her eyes pleading as the fever took her. The boy's crushed body pulled from the timber, his vigil over too soon. June's parting words, "The mountains watch, Clyde. They hunger for us all." The forms drew closer, silent but insistent, their appetite palpable in the air, thick as fog. I floored it through a straightaway, branches whipping the mirrors like farewell strikes. The whispers faded behind, the forms vanishing into the trees, but the vigil didn't end. I burst onto the main road as night fell proper, headlights piercing the dark like accusations. Didn't stop until the mill, unloading with hands that shook, the crew asking if I'd hit a rough patch. I nodded, kept the rest buried. But the silent realism haunts my drives now, a lingering dread that watches from the tree lean. In the quiet cab on lonely hauls, I feel eyes on me, hear whispers in the engine's hum. Was it feral survivors, holding their unending vigil in the wild? Or my own sorrows, given form by the isolation? The mountains keep their appetites secret, and some vigils never break. They endure, silent and sorrowful, waiting in the shadows of every trail.